you. I now declare open the public hearing of the Select Committee on Social Media and Online Safety via teleconference. In accordance with the committee's resolutions, this hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcript of proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. Those present here today are advised that filming and recording are permitted during the hearing. I remind members of the media who may be present or listening on the web of the need to fairly and accurately report the proceedings of the committee. I now welcome representatives of the National Children's Commissioner to give evidence today, and ask that for the Hansard record for you to please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Anne Hollands and I am the National Children's Commissioner. Thank you for the opportunity to appear and to give evidence today.
Thank you, Ms. Hollands. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. In inviting you to make a brief opening statement before we move to questions from the committee, I would also just like to thank you for your submission to our inquiry as well, and just to thank you very much for that. We do appreciate it.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I would like to make a few comments. Thank you very much. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the lands of the Camaragal people of the Eora Nations and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd like to commend the committee on conducting this important inquiry into online safety, which is obviously very complex, but it's an essential examination for the safety of children and a vital opportunity to ensure that any reforms in the online environment are informed by human rights, and in particular, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. As National Children's Commissioner, it's my job to monitor how well our policies, legislation and services are supporting the rights and well-being of all our children, especially those who are living with disadvantage and are likely to miss out on the conditions that support a good childhood. To this end, I welcome this inquiry that seeks to ensure that the online environment is safe for children. In the submission, I outline how the Child's Best Interests Principle, which is one of 4 guiding principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, should be a primary consideration. I also draw the committee's attention to the 10 national principles for child-safe organisations. These were recommended by the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. Principle 8 focuses particularly on managing risks to children in the physical and online environments. However, all 10 of the principles, I think, are relevant to the question of regulatory reform. Before going on, I should also say that rather than focusing on technical aspects, because I'm not a technical expert, and these matters have been well canvassed by previous witnesses, I will be focusing primarily on the child rights implications. Another guiding principle of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 12, requires that children's views are heard and given due weight on decisions that affect them. Children should be provided with an opportunity to participate in legislative and policy development processes, including those processes conducted by the online business community. Today's children, we know, are growing up in a world very different to the one that you and I grew up in. And in fact, I would argue that childhood itself has changed, and that we as parents and as government are trying to catch up with these changes. And we need to listen and learn from the experiences and insights of children and young people themselves. There needs to be a balance struck between mitigating risks and, of course, providing opportunities for children to participate in the online world, which is really very, very much part of our lives today. I need to note that the risks and opportunities of the online world are not experienced equally. For children living in poverty and with additional disadvantages, they can be at more risk of the negative consequences, for example, of social media use, and experience fewer opportunities to use digital technology and social media in positive ways. All children should be provided with the skills and knowledge they need to keep themselves safe online. And parents should also be educated and equipped so that they can fulfil their responsibilities just as they do in the physical world. For example, teaching their kids how to cross the road safely by looking both ways first, and strapping them into their car seats as young children. But education for children and for parents, despite being critical, is insufficient. The best interests of children should be the priority requirement for all internet-based businesses, and this would include strong default privacy settings and human rights by design requirements. There should be a requirement to comply with children's rights principles, such as demonstrated under the National Principles for Child-Safe Organisations in the physical world. This would include a requirement to assess and report the impact on the rights of children at every stage of design, implementation, and operation. And I should add that government can assist by doing the same with its own policies and legislation. Self-regulation, co-regulation, and voluntary industry codes are insufficient and not consistent with legislation and practice in virtually all other fields. Things like safety of cars, safety of toys, safety of playgrounds, safety of food, etc. Algorithms are built to serve the business model of the social media platform, in other words, to help them make money. Algorithms are not built in order to protect children, but they could be, and it's a choice. I believe government has special obligations and a duty of care to children under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Government must require companies to build child safeguarding into their business models through necessary standards and safeguards upstream, not as a reaction to an identified problem. As your other witnesses have shown, the risks that we face are predictable and they're avoidable through good design. We should avoid a fragmented piecemeal approach and establish some core principles that make the best interests of children the priority and the responsibility of online businesses to demonstrate by law as built into their platforms. It should not be the responsibility of children and parents and other vulnerable individuals to try to keep themselves safe from harms that are legally allowed to continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Holland. You've given us actually very interesting, almost a roadmap for conversation. So thank you very much for that. The principle you outlined, Principle 8, managing risks to children, particularly in the online environment. We've heard evidence about the importance of safety by design, the importance of keeping kids safe online, the importance of keeping all users safe online, and yet an acknowledgement that in many ways we're playing catch up, that we're asking for a retrofit, if you like, of infrastructure that is 15 or more years old. We're closer to 20 years old. How do you think, what in your view would be a good way to be able to approach that in terms of, I know you've indicated default settings and I want to get to that, but is that possible, do you think? Do you think it's actually possible, or do you think, how do we tackle that when we're effectively asking for a retrofit?
Look, this is obviously very complex, and a lot of those complexities you've addressed on this committee previously. But I think we've seen that it's been done in other fields. And so I know when I was a child, it wasn't a requirement to have seatbelts on in the car. And there were probably safety features that I'm unaware of technically about cars that are now a requirement. And so that's just one example. Would be many examples of where there's been a transition to a higher standard required of the industry, and it's not been a requirement of the users of those goods and services to try to protect themselves. So we need a transition plan where there is a requirement of retrofitting. I would stress that I think that part of that plan, I know there's work being done now, but I think that we need to move very quickly away from sort of self-regulation or voluntary codes to ones that are actually requirements by law, and then we provide a sort of a transition roadmap to when, allowing them to transition to that place, but then from then on, it's an absolute requirement, certainly for any new builds from there on.
It's interesting that you mention seatbelts. You just mentioned something very close to my heart, a story I heard actually given in the chamber, in the Federation Chamber in the House, outlining the work of one of my predecessors, the great Barry Cohen, a Labor member for Robertson, who fought tirelessly to have airbags implemented into cars as a mandatory requirement. So it's a very interesting observation that you make there, and I'd just like to thank you for that. Retrofitted in a sense, but I guess adapting to technology that is available today and actually making the best use of that technology is almost what you're saying, and that seems to make good sense even in something like online content or online technology.
Well, yes, as I said in my introductory comments, I mean, the algorithms that we have, the technology that's used, it's amazing what can be done. We know that. We know how quickly it's developing, but there is no requirement for that to be put to anything other than the use of making money for the business that's doing it. We need to require that this the fast-paced developing technology that's available now be put to the uses that we require, and that is for the safety of our children as a priority. I think that the government has an absolute obligation under the convention, as I said, to require this, and that we can come up with many examples in other industries where these standards have been implemented and become law. So, of course, there will be, look, I think that part of it is that we're all a bit sort of dazzled by the online world and the technology, and we think it's somehow special or different. But actually, they're just businesses making money. And we know that they're making money at the expense of children's safety now, and that we're only reacting to concerns as they arise, and we're tinkering as we go. We need to probably take a step back and have a holistic systemic review of, what is it that we need in place, and then we need to do a gap analysis of how to get from here to there.
You mentioned default settings to be at the highest privacy level, as opposed to flip the other way. Would you support an extension to that for all users or just for children?
Personally, I would support it for all users, but my main interest, of course, is children.
And first, I do want to thank you for your submission. I just found it covered a broad range of areas that were actually very important. If I have a look at some of you've outlined some of the range of online harms faced by Australians on social media. And I do want to acknowledge in saying this that there's a lot of good, of course, that can be done in the social media space. And of course, it's such a ubiquitous part of the way we interact with one another that it's become a tool, almost like the phone with the extension cord was a tool when I was growing up for communicating. This is actually part and parcel of our everyday lives now.
Correct.
You've provided a number of risks. You've indicated that, and I'll go back to the abuse, some of the issues about exposure to sexual images, etc. I'll come back to that. But this issue about risk to privacy associated with, for instance, the collection and aggregation of children's personal data, sale and misuse of data, etc. This is one of the challenges that we grapple with, isn't it, when having a look at some of the, how do you keep kids safe online with safety by design, whether it be about age verification or other issues, versus how do you keep kids' data and privacy safe? Have you got any sort of comment on some practical steps or practical observations that could be made around that area?
No, Chair, I won't give examples at this stage because I think there are others working on that are much better equipped to do so. But I would just say that I'm optimistic this can be done. I know that we're trying to balance things here. We don't want to keep children away from the beneficial elements of being in the online world, which we're all in now. But we do need to protect them. I think we can do both. And I just think we need to have that commitment to find that way, that pathway through.
You mentioned about behavioural techniques designed to increase engagement. I'm just reading this out. Designed to increase engagement with platforms which trigger impulsive behaviours, influence decision-making, spark fear of exclusion and override privacy concerns. What immediately sprang to mind when I was reading that was things about, algorithms and content directed content based on algorithms, based on preferences or, what you actually look at, etc. Which can be, and I've said before in these public hearings, when I look at my own use, say, of Instagram as a platform, I found that to be enormously helpful. I'm doing some research on some particular areas and I'm getting targeted content and I'm actually finding it extremely useful. But for younger people, would you say that should there be any consideration, for example, given to whether such content should even be directed? Is that sort of what you're getting at? That when, because I look at the way that the brain, for instance, myelinates for risk, or the development of, developmental stages to adulthood, and I just wonder, in an environment like the online one, should we be looking at some of even the basic features of that? And assessing safety by design for children? Should it be as basic as that and fundamental as that?
Yes, I believe the algorithms need to be reviewed, the way that they operate. My understanding, again, not as an expert in this field, but my understanding is that they are designed to try to keep the user online for as long as possible, to expose them to advertising and so forth. To engage them deeply in that experience and to keeping re-engaging them. That might, as you say, there might be some positives in that, but we also know there are significant harms. And so I think that where those algorithms are currently set, and the settings are designed to drive the interest of the user deeper and deeper in a certain direction, that there are dangers in that, obviously. That's just one set of dangers. There are many that need to be reviewed.
And in your submission, you mention some of the risks, including online exploitation, abuse, harassment, cyberbullying, exposure to violent or sexual content, I should say. And you also reference the complaint and remedial mechanisms. My question, some of the evidence that we've heard is, I guess to date, has been conversation around whether complaint mechanisms on social platforms are actually easily accessible and whether they easily resolve complaints and concerns when they arise. Have you had any experience or directed complaints in relation to this, and any observations about those challenges?
No, I haven't had any direct engagement with those issues or complaint. I haven't heard complaints directly along those lines. But my understanding from reading the work of others is that often these mechanisms are not easy to follow. They're not focused on the interests of children. They're not written for children. They're not user friendly, and you know, on the back of the whole, I guess the whole platform not being designed in the best interests of children, then this is just makes it even harder. So I think, again, this is just one layer that needs to be looked at, but I think there needs to be a more fundamental sort of platform review about, and that these businesses be required to demonstrate how they are ensuring that the best interests of children are a primary consideration. That should be the first step, for them to demonstrate that.
You're almost saying flip it, put the onus requirement onto the platform.
Correct.
And just wondering if you could provide some further sort of views of these concerns that you outline, practices such as online tracking, profiling, behavioural monitoring and nudging, the collection of biometric and geolocation data from children. I mean, these are, when you start to list them like this, you can see why this would be in and of itself a concern. Automated decisions affecting children and the unjustifiable sale or transfer of children's personal data to third parties should be banned or heavily restricted to protect children's rights. Do you have any sort of, are you able to elaborate on some of those concerns and perhaps what you'd like to see or how you'd like to see this committee address that?
Well, what those lists demonstrate, they are part of the way that these internet businesses make money, is to do those things. So what we're doing is we're basically harvesting information from children in order for businesses to make money, and that should stop. Now, how we stop that, what the mechanisms is, goes back to your earlier question about retrofitting and the discussion about transitioning to a different way that these businesses are regulated. But and I won't comment on the details of that. But I think that those things that we expose children to without often any meaningful consent process. I mean, it's very difficult to get meaningful consent from children, and we need to also think about how we allow children to delete any data that they've provided during childhood. That we should also look at sort of those erase buttons. I'm sure others have spoken to you about those, that we should consider that children, we have special obligations to children as a country. And so we need to require businesses to act in a way that allows us as a country to meet our special obligations to children.
Mm. I'll just ask one further question and then I might invite the Deputy Chair to ask some questions. I'm conscious I'm taking a lot of time, but I thank you very much for your thoughtful responses. I found this interesting, this statement about children should be provided with an opportunity to participate in legislative and policy development processes on issues that affect children's privacy, including those conducted by the business community, and to have an active say in their individual lives over how their privacy is treated in a given circumstance. And I think that's very, very important. It was also one of the issues that the committee was grappling with as we sort of consider how do you encourage young Australians to have their say, but also keep them safe and their voice safe in the process. That's actually not an easy, it turns out that there's more challenges to navigating that than what is actually a very good aspiration, but it comes with significant challenges if your desire is, as you've said, safety, or we've sort of talked about safety by design inherent in that. So are there what are some of those ways that we could provide more of those opportunities to participate in some of these processes, in your view? Is that through sort of established formal structures, or is it the sort of citizen voice that is important? How do you in practical effect?
So that's a really good question, and it's one of the positive things that we've seen really change in the last few years is that governments and organisations, as part of this sort of the national principles for child-safe organisations, are increasingly engaging directly with children to allow them to have a say as part of the governance processes of organisations, but also at the government level in the design of policy and in the implementation and monitoring of the effectiveness of policy initiatives. So we're on a journey to learn how to do this well, but as you point out, one way is through formal mechanisms, such as the Youth Advisory Group that the E-Safety Commissioner has established recently, and other formal bodies, advisory councils and so forth, of which there are many around the country now. One of the limitations of that sort of formal mechanism is that one tends to attract certain types of young people to those. Sometimes I refer to them as the school prefects. The ones who are articulate, perhaps are well-resourced and supported to participate in such forums. One of the things as a contrasting example, I had the opportunity last year to consult directly with children and young people who are in very disadvantaged circumstances around the country. And these children, may not be in school, may be homeless, living in poverty and so forth. And so that requires a different approach. Certainly the National Children's Commissioner role is one that under the Act is consulting with children is one of its functions. And of course that requires certain resources to be able to achieve that. But it is certainly the role of the National Children's Commissioner can provide guidance in doing that for any government departments that are wanting to engage directly with children in their policy and legislative development roles, and to do it either directly, as I've just described, or indeed in establishing more formal standing mechanisms, as there are many more of them now. One of the things I have recommended to government is that I think we can improve how we do this, that we can look to some overseas examples of, if you like, international best practice, doing this well in a meaningful way that engages young people in a way that is authentic and doesn't just hear their voice, but actually demonstrates how their insights and advice have been translated into policy. So, this is not just we listen to kids, we tick that box. This needs to be a much more meaningful process than that. But certainly that's something that the National Children's Commissioner role at the Australian Human Rights Commission can assist with.
Thank you very much for that. Questions from the Deputy Chair?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Commissioner, for appearing before us today. It's quite timely, actually, the topic of what we're talking about. I'm not sure that whether you've seen the US President's announcements in this space in the lead up to the State of the Union speech.
No, what today? I haven't, no.
You couldn't have been more timely, because perhaps while you've been speaking, there's been an announcement that the US intends to strengthen children's privacy and ban targeted advertising for children online. And banning excessive data collection on and targeted advertising online for children and young people. So based on the evidence you've been giving today, it sounds like you'd be supportive of an initiative like that?
Yes, of course, yes.
And at the same time, they're also talking about prioritising safety by design standards, something we're very familiar with in Australia for online platforms. And it's interesting that they're framing this as safety by design dictates that the platforms need to be conscious of vulnerable audiences, audiences that might be more significantly impacted. And one of the examples they give is children, adolescents and teens who are uniquely vulnerable to harmful and dangerous content online. That's accords with your thinking on these issues too.
Correct, absolutely, and it needs to be absolutely a priority, not optional, and not a voluntary code process. We need to embed this in legislation as a requirement.
So we heard from the Alana and Madeline Foundation earlier in this inquiry, and their advice to us was that we adopt, quote, the best interests of the child as the primary guiding principle for the work that we do on this committee. And that if we do that, then all the steps that we take to uphold children's best interests on digital platforms will be as constructive and healthy as possible. I'm trying to understand what this looks like in practice today. How often does either government or the platforms get on the phone to you, for example, to seek your advice on how to think about these issues through the prism of the best interests of the child?
Hardly ever. So I think this is where so certainly when there's new legislation, sometimes I get they do a sort of a check on how compliant they are with the treaties, the human rights treaties, and so on. And at the Australian Human Rights Commission, we might be asked to participate. In fact, I was participating in such a meeting just earlier this morning on the anti-trolling legislation, the Defamation Task Force of the Attorney General's Department. And I made the comment at that meeting that whilst I welcomed the opportunity to provide some comments in that way, what I would prefer to see is a proactive approach whereby that there is a demonstration of how a particular piece of legislation or an amendment or something will ensure the best interests of children as a primary consideration. I'd like to see that demonstrated. And that is not a practice in this country, to do that in that proactive way. I think I've been in my role just over a year now, and my observation has been that children's unique needs and issues tend to be overlooked. Policy is designed primarily for the concerns of adults. We saw some problems with that during COVID for all the reasons we understand, with the pressures and, you know, the need for speed and so forth. But there have been unintended indirect consequences for the mental health of children and their learning and development and well-being generally that we're only now starting to understand. And the problem with that problem with children being an afterthought in policy is that the harms that they suffer in this unique stage of development can have lifelong consequences. So I often say every day matters in the life of a child, and we need to be much more concerned to place children's needs as a national policy priority. That's what I'm looking for. And doing it in terms of the regulation of online businesses is just one part of a much bigger piece where, as I said, it's been my observation that children's needs are typically overlooked.
And so we heard evidence from the Attorney General's Department earlier in this inquiry that they hadn't engaged with you on that piece of that trolling defamation bill during the drafting of the legislation, but they said that they would come and talk to you later. And what you're sort of saying here, as I understand it, is that almost puts the cart before the horse, that if we're taking a best interest of the child approach, we need to start primarily from how are we going to address protecting the best interest of the child, rather than subsequently asking, here, we've developed this piece of legislation, what are the impacts on children of this approach? Am I understanding that right?
Yes, correct. I think that would save a lot of time and grief, actually, if there was an involvement early on from a child rights perspective. I mean, and again, we can assist with that. But to your first question, we're very rarely asked to contribute at that early stage.
And it sounds like that's a similar story when it comes to the platforms as well as government, that they don't sort of invite you in at the outset to say, hey, we've got this new product, or, you know, we're thinking of changing the way we're doing something. Do you want to come in and talk to us about how to do this in a way that puts the best interest of the child at the heart of what we're doing?
To my knowledge, there's never been an approach from one of the platforms to the Office of the National Children's Commissioner, certainly not in my time, and I'm not aware of prior to that. I expect that they do engage frequently with the e-Safety Commissioner, which obviously that is appropriate as well. But I would think there would be benefits in engaging with the National Children's Commissioner early on also. And really, we're here to help.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that this is a question of sort of confusion on a coordination front, where either government or the platforms think, oh, the e-Safety Commissioner, that's who to engage with, you know, consultation box checked, and that they're not aware that you can add an additional perspective? Or do you think it's you know, an obliviousness, you know, to the need to consider things through a child's perspective?
Well, I think, well, possibly a bit of both. I mean, I think there is a lack of understanding of the role and the benefits of engaging with the National Children's Commissioner. The National Children's Commissioner is a relatively new role, newer actually than the e-Safety Commissioner's role. And as you know, the e-Safety Commissioner's role began as the Children's e-Safety Commissioner role. So there may well be understandable confusion there. But that could easily be addressed. And I think that really what we need to see is that the internet businesses that we're sort of talking about here, that they see the need to have very good advice in what they're building right from the beginning, and perhaps they haven't seen the need to do that either. But that's where I think this inquiry can really assist to reinforce that children's needs should be a priority issue. To that extent, they're no different than perhaps anyone else in society. As I've just said, children's needs are not a number one priority generally in policy, and I think that also needs to change.
So to sort of assist the committee on the sort of general principles around what a putting the best interests of the child at the heart of what we do approach would look like. One of the things we've heard, in fact, from the Mental Health Commissioner and from other advocacy groups, is that when it comes to children, it's very important that you have tailored processes for children that, you know, don't necessarily look like the same processes that it would be appropriate for adults, for example. So, you know, more streamlined processes, less adversarial processes, less sort of conflict-driven processes, less scary, I suppose is the way you could call it. Is that accord with the sort of expert advice in this space?
Well, yes. Look, I think we need to make it easy for kids to be safe. So we need to do whatever it takes to ensure their safety. And so, you know, we need to also shift the burden of responsibility from children and parents for keeping kids safe, although they have their role, of course, as I said in my introductory remarks. But the burden of responsibility must be with the businesses that are making money out of these children engaging on their platforms, and obviously government's role to require that. I understand, if I can just add, that I believe the UK Code has tried to do this to match their standards with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I can't share with you at this time the details of that, but I could, if you were interested, provide further information on that if that hasn't been made available to you.
I think that would be useful to us, yes. I think the more we can elevate these issues and this prism of the rights of the child, the better, because it's kind of as you observed, often honoured in the afterthought than at the beginning of these processes. So I think embedding that would be useful. So just, I mean, you raised earlier that the anti-trolling defamation consultation, and that's been SPRUICT as an intervention designed to protect children from trolling. From your perspective, are adversarial judicial proceedings fit for purpose for helping to protect children in this context?
No, not at all. But my understanding from the briefing I received was that this legislation is not particularly targeting any cohort such as children in terms of their safety. So that it basically doesn't disadvantage children any further than existing legislation. This is how I was briefed, but that it doesn't necessarily protect them any further either. And you're absolutely right that children and vulnerable adults would be very, very unlikely to be in a position to take action if there's a need to do so.
Yeah, it's just that there's an unfortunate disconnect between the way that the Attorney General's Department talks about the purpose of this legislation and the way that the Prime Minister has talked about the purpose of this legislation. It's the only reason that I ask what seems like a fairly obvious question there. What's your impression of working with the E-Safety Commission? I mean, they obviously grew out of the Children's E-Safety Commission. The general evidence heard by this committee is that the Safety Commission has been, world leading in the safety by design approach, and generally the evidence has been that they have a good working relationship both with the platforms, but also with parents and particularly schools. Does that accord with your sort of observations in this space?
Well, certainly they provide an enormous suite of resources for parents and for children and available through the schools and so forth. But that's not all they do. Obviously, they are working on actual reforms to the platforms and engaging with those platforms. So I guess really what I want to sort of focus on here today in my comments is that the education of children and their parents is just one aspect. And I perhaps would like to see stronger moves by the Safety Commission and the government as a whole to ensure that the regulation of this industry provides the protections that are needed as a matter of priority for children.
Yeah. No, we've certainly heard that message loud and clear. One of the issues that's come up with the Safety Commissioner and the platforms that seems to be a difference of opinion is in the way that the cyberbullying regime is implemented by the Safety Commissioner. It seems there's a practice that the Safety Commission won't sort of send a formal sort of notice to perpetrators, if in inverted commas, of this cyberbullying, because the view is that that may be intimidatory and traumatizing for what is often another child bullying another child, and that they prefer to sort of have a 360-degree intervention where they help resolve the fundamental conflict with the school and the parents involved and the children. Some of the platforms have suggested that perhaps there might be an educative function in sort of sending these notices, and I think that's informed by the fact that we're moving to an adult cyber abuse scheme now, and you could see probably more merit to sending end user notices to adults who are engaging in this kind of behaviour. I mean, does that sound sensible to you, that kind of approach the Safety Commission is taking?
Yes, I think it sounds sensitive and age appropriate. I think absolutely we know that a lot of these offenders are kids themselves, and that needs to be managed very, very carefully, that they may well themselves be expressing, if you like, the results of their own abuse in their own lives. We just don't know. And so we have to manage these situations extremely carefully. That said, I haven't had any direct involvement in that process that you've described the E-Safety Commissioner undertakes, and I would be very happy to have a look at that and to more closely and to express a more educated view of how those things have played out, if that was useful.
And just a final question. We've sort of, you can appreciate this is an issue that sort of straddles so many different areas of policy. It's difficult to get your arms around the different dimensions to this issue. And one of the questions that we've been grappling with as a committee is the coordination mechanisms of how we coordinate policy on multiple fronts dealing with this multifaceted issue. So I'm interested in what the nature of the kind of regular formal consultation engagement that you have with the regulatory agencies in this space. Do you have regular catch-ups scheduled with, say, the Safety Commissioner or other regulatory agencies in space, like the Privacy Commissioner? Are there formal structures that you have a sort of a permanent sort of seat on to enable these issues to be ventilated, or is it more ad hoc?
Currently, it's more ad hoc. And look, that may be a factor of history with the fact that there hasn't been a National Children's Commissioner as long as some of these other privacy and e-safety commissioners, and that could be further developed. I do think that there is value in applying different lenses on these issues, and we do come from different perspectives, as you sort of are picking up. So I would welcome the opportunity for deeper collaboration on these, I guess these very complex problems that this committee is dealing with today.
Yeah, we would have a better chance of putting the best interests of the child at the start of the process rather than looking at the impacts on children at the end of the process if you were part of the conversation from the outset.
Well, that's right. And I guess that's the primary contribution that I can make in a conversation, because I don't have those technical or legal areas of knowledge that some of the others do. But I think, what we're discussing now is how do we make children the priority up front? And I think there are ways of engaging with the National Children's Commissioner role more effectively by all parties, including government itself, going forward.
Great. That's been really useful for me. Thank you. I've got no more questions, Chair.
Thank you,
Mr. Watts.
Questions and also the responses given. It's really interesting though, but it's almost opened up more questions than answers, which is always a good thing. But I'm looking at it, and at the same time, I'm looking at some of the questions, the responses to questions on notice given to us by social media platforms. And I'm almost, maybe it is this whole thing of safety by design, going back to some of the fundamentals, because I'm looking at the existing so-called safety and seeing how it doesn't match with what I would have thought was basic community expectations, or the pub test, if you like. And I'm thinking, well, if we can't get it right there, that's almost like the first step. And how do we then do some of these things? So it might even be having a holistic look as opposed to segmented look to get it right for children by getting it right for all.
Yes, well, I would agree that it does require a whole systemic approach, not a piecemeal, fragmented approach. And in fact, by putting children as the priority, as we've been discussing this morning, actually that will help to improve it for all users ultimately. This is perhaps the most complex area that we need to fix. And if we can do it in a holistic, whole of system upstream reform kind of perspective rather than reactive and piecemeal, then I think we've got a better chance.
Final question, there might be many more questions, but I'm just thinking of a Daily Telly article I read today, a very sad and tragic situation. And we talk about keeping kids safe online. Some of the behaviours that we're talking about actually come from kids.
Yes.
What more needs to be done, or what can be done to prevent harm from occurring in the first place? There's one thing to talk about the vehicle that is used for harm, but social media platforms themselves do not put that content on there. It's an individual who's putting up, revenge images or hateful content or cyberbullying, or someone is doing that. Is there a further conversation that needs to be had there? Do you think it's worse now with social media apps and online apps than it was when, 20, 30, 40 years ago. Can you see changes there or?
Well, certainly the exposure is much greater now, and often there's no escape, as they say. It used to happen in the schoolyard, now it happens in the bedroom. And there are very, very serious consequences for the mental health and well-being of our young people as a result. And I know that other witnesses have spoken to that. But, as a psychologist myself, I've definitely worked with young people and their families who have experienced this. I think that there is obviously there is a lot to be done in terms of education from the various earliest stages, but not just education of kids, education of parents alongside children. And I think that's one area that we in our school systems we probably could go harder on trying to invite parents in so the parents are learning the same things that the children are. And it goes right through. This is not just about how to behave online. This is about basic respectful relationships and compassion and empathy for others. This is a much broader question, is it not? That we should be building into the way that we educate our children in early childhood education all the way through. As you point out, Chair, that the platforms are just a vehicle for expressing, unfortunately, some of these, negative behaviours that become quite pervasive in the lives of kids. But so I think it goes hand in hand in terms of how we're teaching ethical behaviour, how we're teaching empathy for others and mutual respect and so forth. The other thing I think really we have to recognise is that some children and young people are themselves victims of abuse in their own homes and by their own parents. And so parents are not always, children are not always, I guess they're not able to get the support and the guidance they need from parents. Some children just don't have that. And so again, we need to be mindful of how we support them, how we try to, how these platforms can stop the negative behaviours that you're describing when there's no, if you like, no guidance from the home to assist with that.
There's a whole other conversation I suspect we could be having as you're talking. I'm looking at an article from August last year from The Examiner with someone saying that Snapchat can be a challenge and that there's no safe way for children to use the platform even above the age of 13. It's interesting when you talk about safety by design, and I'm now beginning to think, does safety by design for children by extension create safety by design for all? It's just an interesting concept. I don't know how we call that with the various competing rights that you also need to look at. But, there are some very challenging and confronting questions before this committee. I think there's no doubt about that.
Well, as I said earlier, I'm confident it can be done. It is a very complex set of issues, but if we're committed to ensuring the human rights of children and to protecting their best interests, then we will find a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting even in the issue of that might seem simple, let's have an age cutoff. I know that this conversation around age verification, don't have kids under the age of 13 or whatever the sort of minimum age is for sign up. But you've indicated here in your submission a blanket or blunt approach to age restrictions and consent may therefore not be necessary or desirable.
Mm-hmm.
I guess if age restriction is not the answer to some of these things, what is, or is it more that we know that something needs to be done, we're confident it can be done, let's actually get that done even if it's iterative? Because sometimes there seems to be more roadblocks and impediments to some of the suggestions put forward than there are doors that open.
Well, I think it's about learning, for example, from the UK that has experimented with this. I know that the e-safety commissioner has been funded to do a piece of work on this. It's not simple, but we need to keep moving forward, and it needs to be contextualised, that there isn't one solution that in its, that will address these complex issues. We need to be moving on all fronts simultaneously.
Really, thank you for your time and your thoughtful responses today. We very much appreciate it, and appreciate also the submission that you've made to this committee. And just indicate that if you do have any additional information, or you've been asked to provide any additional information, to please forward it through to the Secretary by the 9th of March 2022, to indicate that you'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and you'll have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. I now adjourn this public hearing until 2 p.m. this afternoon, and in doing so, I'd very much like to thank you for your time, your attendance, and your thoughtful responses here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
In accordance with the committee's resolutions, indicate that the hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcript of proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. To remind those present here today that filming and recording are permitted during the hearing, and to remind members of the media who may be present or listening on the web of the need to fairly and accurately report the proceedings of the committee. And I now welcome representatives of SNAP to give evidence today, and ask that for the Hansard record for you to please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee.
Thank you, Chair. Good to be here today. My name's Henry Turnbull. I'm the head of public policy for APAC for Snap Inc., which is the company that makes Snapchat.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament, and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. In inviting you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to questions and discussions with the committee, I did want to thank you for the submission that you made to the Social Media and Online Safety Inquiry, which for the record, I believe is submission number 16. We very much appreciate that. Do you have any opening comments you'd like to make before we...
Yeah, I do have a very short statement, Chair, if that's okay. So first, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. This is an important inquiry asking some very important questions, so I'm glad to be here and glad to be able to contribute. As you say, I imagine the committee has reviewed our submission, so I won't repeat that here, but hopefully what came across from that submission is that Snapchat is a very different type of service to traditional broadcast style social media platforms. A lot of thought goes into the design and build of Snapchat with the aim of preventing the opportunity for illegal and harmful content to spread, rather than just reacting to it when it does happen. And there's a real focus on safety and privacy by design of our products and features. These processes are reflected in the fact that Snapchat works differently and the features that we enable and don't enable. So for example, there's no ability to publicly comment on another user's pictures or videos on Snapchat. And we moderate public content before it can be seen by large numbers of people. These are design decisions that are very different to those taken by many other online platforms, and we believe they make Snapchat a safer environment. Over 319 million people around the world use Snapchat every day, over 5 million of those here in Australia, and we recognize we have an important responsibility to keep those people safe. As such, I very much welcome this conversation, and I'll do my best to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Turnbull. We do appreciate that. And it's interesting that in your submission, you notice, you actually specifically note that your design process is safety by design as well as privacy by design. Safety by design has been a bit of a common feature of some of the conversations that we've had through this committee inquiry process. And I guess some of the comments have included observations around retrofitting safety by design. You're saying that, if I'm reading your submission correctly, you're basically saying, in your view, Snap has built that in from the get-go?
Yeah, maybe I could talk a little bit about those processes
that would be
and
helpful.
how they work. So essentially we use, and I know this is a big subject here, and the eSafety Commissioner talks about it a lot, so it is aligned with our thinking in a lot of ways. But we basically use two principles that guide our design process: safety by design, which is about prioritizing the safety of our community; privacy by design, which focuses on data minimization and protecting user data. How that actually works in practice is that privacy and safety specialists, legal counsel, as well as members of our platform integrity team, they're involved throughout the design and build of any new product and feature at Snapchat, from conception right through to release, and then afterwards kind of testing it as we go. And I think importantly, anybody who uses Snapchat can see that these are reflected in the way that the app works. So just a few examples. When you open Snapchat, you don't open into a news feed of other people's content, which might encourage you to kind of scroll through or passively consume. You open into the camera, which encourages you to engage with the world around you, send a picture to a friend. I think I mentioned we don't offer the ability to publicly comment on other pictures or videos. We've seen elsewhere how that can amplify harmful interactions. And really importantly, I think for this conversation and lots of conversations around online safety, we don't offer the ability to publicly post whatever you like on Snapchat. So public-facing content in the app, whether it's in our Discover tab for news and entertainment or our Spotlight tab for the community's most popular snaps, all of that content is pre-moderated before it can be seen by wide groups of people. 25 is the maximum number of people that a piece of content can be seen by before it's moderated by our trust and safety team in those sides of the app. So that helps us ensure that content which violates our guidelines is not broadcast in public spaces on Snapchat. There's a few kind of tangible examples of how it works in practice, I suppose.
I'm interested because I look, yours is the only, I look at this, and I guess some of the conversations that I've had with parents in my community, or even with, to be honest, young people here on the Central Coast, where they've indicated that Snapchat is probably one of the areas where there are some challenges in relation to the sharing of images, for example, that have not been consented to be shared by others. I had a look at this morning at an article from the Examiner last year where a cyber safety expert is saying parents should say no to Snapchat even over the age of 13, and indicating that there's no safe way for children to use this platform. Do you have any sort of observations about that, and I guess some of the inherent safety by design features that might be built in for children? Or in your view, do you think there's a gap that could be looked at?
Maybe it's helpful if I focus on the issue of kind of intimate image abuse, which you started the question with, and we can kind of go from there. Totally recognize how distressing it can be for people to have their private images or videos of themselves, particularly intimate images, shared without their consent. When we go back to safety by design, Snapchat is actually designed in a way that makes collecting this kind of content extremely difficult, because you may be aware the default setting for snaps is that they disappear after viewing, right? They delete by default, and you can't. It's difficult to save those. Now, phones do have an inbuilt capability, unfortunately, to take screenshots. This is not a Snapchat feature. This is not something that's Snapchat specific. It's just something that's inbuilt into phones. But we have looked to think about that and think, how do we alert our community if somebody is engaged in that kind of behavior? So if a user takes a screenshot of a snap or of a conversation, regardless of what it's of, we will notify the other person telling them that that's happened. And that kind of screenshotting is behavior that we actively discourage. We also offer easy to use in-app reporting tools so users can quickly report concerning content. We are aware that this kind of activity unfortunately does happen. We've worked on the partnership side to address it as well. We've partnered with the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, or CCRI, who are one of the world's leading NGOs addressing this issue of basically non-consensual sharing of private sexual material. They're a trusted flagger on Snapchat. That means that they have a dedicated channel for them to report this kind of content and for our team to review it as a matter of priority. I guess that the last thing that I would say about this is sort of education is important, educating our community, both on the fact that this kind of behavior is totally unacceptable, but also about the security of their images and of their phones themselves. And it's been a real focus for us thinking about ways that we can, within the app, educate our users about this. Just before last year, we actually sent out a mass snap message, a message that went to all Snapchat users, encouraging them to use two-factor authentication to protect their account. We also launched a dedicated safety channel in our Discover tab for news and entertainment, which provides advice for users on keeping their accounts secure. So I do acknowledge it's an issue, but we're doing everything that we can to address it. And I guess also to build into the design of the app things that make this kind of activity difficult to do.
I feel like what I might do is send you a copy of this article in particular, because a leading cyber safety expert is actually talking about the challenge of the use of social platforms like Snapchat and the link between technology and some of the exploitation that can happen to minors.
Yeah.
What are some of the
please feel free to share the article. I'm not
yeah,
sure
I might do that and just ask for your comment in relation to that, because I do take your point that there are what you would think would be inbuilt safety features, but then I go to the practical outworking of what I hear from everyday conversations in my electorate, for example, of people who have found that inappropriate images have been shared, call it revenge, call it whatever you want, to whole groups of people. Sometimes they're sitting next to them and suddenly this unwanted image has popped up in someone else's Snapchat feed. What specific steps do you take, do you have specific steps for users under the age of 18 to help reduce some of the incident or to help tackle some of these challenges? They're very real challenges. I'm skirting around it, but if I was being blunt, I would let you know that this is not a conversation I have in a one-off capacity. It's one that's often raised with me when you're talking with, say, kids, high school kids.
No, and I totally appreciate that. I think, to your point around policies for under 18-year-olds, I think again this is where design is important. So, in a way that is different to other platforms, public-facing content on Snapchat is all designed to be suitable for an audience of the age of 13 and above. So there's nothing that's going to be surfaced to you without searching for it that is unsuitable for anybody below the age of 13 in those public spaces of the app. That's because we curate and moderate and apply, there's moderation applied to anything that's seen by more than 25 people. So we can kind of make sure that those areas of the app are as safe and audience appropriate as possible. Now, we can't altogether prevent any kind of harmful or illegal activity from happening in people's private communications, in their private stories or their private group chats. That's not something that we proactively monitor, with the exception of technology that can detect known child sexual abuse imagery, where I think there's a clear rationale for that. But I think outside of that, people, generally speaking, don't assume that we're not proactively monitoring or scanning all of their private messages, and that's not something that we do. When we get into those areas of the app, what we focus on is giving people the ability to really quickly and easily report harmful content, and then ensuring that we act upon it quickly. I should say Snapchat is currently, as far as I'm aware, we're the only major platform that provides country-specific breakdowns of our transparency reports. So like, you can see a dedicated page for Australia that shows how many pieces of content were taken down were reported over the course of the last 6 months, how many pieces of content were taken down, how many accounts were enforced. No other platform that I know does that. Our transparency report also indicates that for every key category of harmful content, our median response time, so like the average response time to those reports, was less than 30 minutes. So I guess there's different elements of moderation and response that we apply to different areas of the app. Public areas we heavily curate. Private areas, we do rely on reporting to an extent, but we aim to respond incredibly quickly.
You've mentioned embedded protection mechanisms. Do you have any threshold around that? And if so, can you just sort of provide an outline of how that works?
Sorry, do you mind expanding on that question slightly?
So you've got preventing strangers from contacting people they don't know. You've got a focus on prevention.
Mhm.
in relation to content moderation and enforcement.
Of course. So
Just wondering if you can outline a little bit more about that,
yeah,
and
absolutely.
whether there's any sort of threshold barriers or threshold.
So there are most of these things we just apply across the platform, regardless of your age. But what I would say is that the default settings are safety and privacy focused. So you can never see somebody else's friends list on Snapchat. Even if we were friends on Snapchat, you couldn't see my list of friends. You couldn't see geographical information about me. There's never the option to share your location on Snap Maps, which is our map feature, with anybody apart from your friends, or a dedicated subset of your friends. Default settings are that you can't message or receive a message from anybody who isn't your friend. All of these are things that, they're applied to your point about thresholds, they're applied to all of our users, but they are, I would say privacy, designed with privacy and safety in mind.
Is there any? Okay. And I recognise. Sorry, I just want to say, Mr. Chamber, I do recognise the challenge of this, because some of this is around. Some of this is around actions of individuals who are users of your platform, and I just want to acknowledge that. So I'm not sort of in any way sort of suggesting that is therefore something that Snap is wholly responsible for, but just as this is existing on every social, these challenges are regardless of which platform.
Yeah, and that's why I think this inquiry is important, right? These are important questions for us all.
Yeah, and we appreciate you appearing and working through some of these difficult things. I want to go back to this because, see, this is a challenge. This concept of safety by design, and yet I've got, for example, just a very quick Google gives me, or a very quick internet search gives me an article. Parents should say no to Snapchat, and talks about the prevalence and the challenge of Snapchat being used for online sexual solicitation of children through social media. And that's a challenge, not because of inherently Snapchat, but because of how these tools are then used. And I guess my question is that I'm grappling with, coming back to your concept of safety by design, is there more that should be done or could be done to reduce or prevent harm in this world? Now, whether it be something like what I've just described, or whether it be something that I've heard from a young 20-year-old, just recently, talking about the prevalence of some of the sharing of, images without consent, to a wider group of people.
Yeah, I think
that never used to, that wasn't something that I had to deal with when I was growing up, because the mechanism wasn't there. The mechanism's here now. How do we make sure young people are safe online, given the mechanism that makes this so easily prevalent?
Yeah, and I think it's a very good point. And to your question, I don't think these efforts are ever done. Like, it's not like we kind of sit back on our laurels at Snap and think, oh, we're fine, that we've designed this app, it's very safe, there's nothing bad that can further happen. Like, it's an iterative process. There are people working on these issues that I work with every day, and there's always more that we can do. And working with safety organizations and experts in countries in which we operate is an important part of that. I could just maybe focus on a couple of elements. One, I think, unfortunately, young people are very reluctant to report harmful content on online platforms. This is something that you see across, research across different platforms, and that's something that we need to do a better job of encouraging and addressing myths about it, right? So a lot of people think, oh, if I report somebody on Snapchat or another platform, that the person who I reported will know it was me. Like, that's just categorically not the case. So we've been working on different ways to try and raise awareness in-app in ways that are sort of Snapchat friendly and visually accessible and appealing to younger people, but that address those myths and kind of encourage reporting. But that's one element of it. I think the other is, this is to your earlier point, is behavioral change among people themselves, and young people themselves is also important. And, the difficult truth with online harms, as we call them, is that they're all, certainly the vast majority of them are perpetrated by regular people, not by, algorithms or by computers, but by people. And I think working with schools, working with safety organizations to actually educate people about the impact, like the terrible impact that some of this kind of behavior, such as intimate image abuse, can have on people, I think is really important. So there's two elements, but it's you know, this is a piece of work that is never going to be done either at Snap or at any other company.
When you talk about reporting mechanisms, how easy is it to access that reporting mechanism? You say young people don't tend to report. Is that how easy is it, and how often is action taken? What proportion of reporting? So if you look at proportionally, if there's 100 complaints, how many of them are resolved in the affirmative for the complainant?
So it's super easy to report. You hold your thumb down on the offending snap, which is like a visual message, or on the user, and then within, you know, 1 or 2 clicks, there's an option, the flagging option, and we worked hard to make that as easy as possible and actually to reduce the opportunities for friction. And sometimes you'll talk to governments and or regulators, and they should say, well, you should have a very comprehensive list of, you know, 25 different harms that people can pick so you can ensure that they're all reflected. Actually, all the research shows that the more steps and the more friction you add to that process, the more people you lose. So basically, you want as few steps as possible, and that's what we've endeavored to do. To the second part of your question, after this call, I'll share our transparency report with you, which has a dedicated page for Australia, which shows the total number of reports that we've had across different categories of harmful content, which proportion of those were actioned, and how many unique accounts were actioned as well. Not every report is going to be a valid report. Sometimes people report just for the sake of it, but that has, you know, country-specific data, which, as I've said, I think we're the only platform that provides this of how we respond to different kind of categories of report.
I'd be interested also in some further information, if you would be so good as to provide it, around safety by design, specifically the approach that is taken to safety by design for children, to those under 18. I know that you have a minimum age threshold for sign up, but you know, what additional safety steps, if any, are taken to keep young people safe on the platform, given your stated, you know, the inherent framework you're saying is safety by design. So what are those additional safety by design features for young people?
I'd be very happy to answer any questions that you have in writing.
Thank you. I'll put that one out there if that's okay for response. Questions from the Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to representatives for Snap for attending this hearing. I won't recover the terrain that the Chair has covered, though I would reiterate my support for the importance of those issues. I do want to draw out, though, the areas of your submission that deal with the crowded regulatory landscape in the area of online safety in Australia. This is a theme that we've heard throughout this inquiry. Can you elaborate for the committee a little bit on the risks that you see for good public policy outcomes from this crowded landscape? Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll just give a little bit of background about what we consider to be kind of effective regulation, and I'll talk a little bit about Australia. But if I'm going on too long, Deputy Chair, please do let me know. So essentially, we support the case for regulation that improves the safety of users. But it's also extremely important that regulation is designed in a way that enables new and innovative approaches to safety and privacy to be developed, and that enables smaller challenger companies to continue to grow and thrive. I've kind of set out earlier today how Snap approaches issues around safety in a very different way from some of the other platforms that you'll have been speaking to, and it's important to allow for that variety and flexibility. From our perspective, the best way to do that is through establishing one comprehensive, clear regulatory framework. So that's the model being pursued in the EU through the Digital Services Act. To an extent, that's the model being pursued in the UK through the Online Safety Bill. Where regulation goes wrong is where it becomes overly prescriptive and complex, and it focuses too much on process and outputs rather than impact and outcomes. That complexity actually sort of perversely just favors the largest companies, who in many cases have inspired this regulation in the first place,
because they have the largest compliance teams and they can easily deal with complex regulation, while smaller companies would actually fall by the wayside. In relation to Australia, the overall landscape here is becoming very complex, particularly for newer entrants, with lots of different pieces of proposed legislation or regulation, different codes and different pieces of guidance as part of that. You know, if I name a few: Abhorrent Violent Material Act, the Online Safety Act, the proposed Privacy Bill, the proposed Anti-Trolling Bill. That's actually only a few of relatively more recent announcements. That complexity is very challenging for smaller companies. If you have one clear framework, regulatory framework, it makes it simpler for companies to understand their obligations. It makes it simpler for the government and regulators to hold people to account. It makes it simpler for consumers to understand their rights. This, rather than complexity, I think is what actually leads to a safer environment for all. I do think you have the germs of that, or we have the germs of that in Australia with the Online Safety Act. You could potentially look at sort of broadening out that legislation, which is a good start to really be the core of that central regulatory framework. But at the moment, it does feel very confusing from our perspective.
Some witnesses have proposed a consolidation of these different regulatory schemes within a single Online Safety Act. Would that sort of assist with this issue, particularly for new entrants or sort of challenger companies?
I certainly think so, yeah. Yeah. And I actually think that, you know, the core of the Online Safety Act, you know, represents a pretty practical and well-considered approach to online safety regulation here in Australia. You know, it is principled, certainly the basic online safety expectations, and obviously we're working now to develop a code with the eSafety Commissioner, but those expectations, you know, they are principles based. They focus on the outcomes that platforms should deliver rather than really granular certain processes that might not be relevant for everybody. It grants flexibility. It's guided by accountability, but enforced by the eSafety Commissioner. That's the kind of model that I think works best in this space. It's just, as you say, trying to sort of rationalize that wider landscape, and there's lots of different pieces of regulation under that framework, I think would be helpful.
So I wonder whether you could sort of provide us with a bit of an insight into the realities of complying with this complex regulatory construct from a company like Snap, who, you know, is a big company internationally, but small relative to some of the competitors. You know, like what does your regulatory and legal compliance team and your challenge look like in this space?
Yeah, and I think Snap is in a position now where we have people on the ground who are able to dedicate their, you know, we've got myself, just one public policy person, but we have myself in APAC who's able to look at the development of these, to talk to our legal and compliance teams to work out the implications for us. But I think 5 or so years ago that wouldn't be the case. There's a lot of other platforms who aren't in that position. So, you know, we are in a position that we can evaluate those different laws, whether it's the existing ones like the Abhorrent Violent Material Act, or looking at some of the new bills being proposed and work out how we could comply. Although I have to say some of the pieces of legislation currently being considered, particularly the Privacy Bill and the Anti-Trolling Bill, it's difficult to see how I guess privacy-focused organizations could comply with that and could comply with pieces of those legislation and still be in compliance with their privacy principles. I think it's very difficult.
I'm just move on to some other questions soon, but do you want to just sort of draw out what is that inherent inconsistency that makes complying with both of those regimes difficult?
Sure. I mean, so I'll touch on them both very briefly. You know, the Privacy Bill, I think most of the requirements in there are actually pretty privacy, designed to protect privacy and ensure the privacy of users, which is something that we've been committed to for a long time at Snap. But there are measures in there which are actually privacy invasive rather than privacy protecting. So you have a requirement for a draft requirement for parental consent, as I understand it, for anybody below the age of 16 in order to use an online platform. Like, there's a whole host of privacy and ethical reasons about whether that's actually a good idea. But if you're just thinking about how you make it work, you're essentially mandating the collection of ID both by younger people but also their parents in order to make that work. And mandating tech companies to collect that information, I don't think is in keeping with the aims of the bill. And I think it would be difficult to see how we could comply with that. On the anti-trolling bill, as I understand it, that the complaint scheme that they're proposing would essentially mandate companies to hand over the personal information of users without their consent to people who feel that they had been defamed or insulted online. And again, I struggle to see a world in which privacy-focused platforms who are committed to protecting their users' data and complying with the priorities of data privacy regulators around the world could do that in good conscience. So that's a very brief run through of those our concerns of those two bills.
Yeah, one of the things that we've been grappling with in this committee is that, you know, the digital platforms are sort of so all-encompassing in modern life. They sort of touch so many spheres of our modern life that we see an extremely wide range of regulatory authorities and government departments addressing specific harms in their vertical space. You know, so just in this space, we have, you know, the OAIC, the ACCC, the ACMA, the Safety Commissioner, Attorney General's Department, the former Comms Department, you know, our intelligence and security agencies, all weighing in, Home Affairs, all weighing in with regulatory approaches in this area. You sort of talked about some of the sort of underlying inconsistencies between some of these approaches. Do you think that the Australian regulatory framework would benefit from some, you know, first principles engagement between these agencies to try and agree on what we're actually trying to achieve across the board in this space, so that we're not stepping on each other's toes and pulling in different directions?
I definitely think so. Yeah, I mean, my previous role at Snap was covering UK policy until last autumn, and in the UK they struggled with a lot of similar issues around, you know, this is obviously the hot topic issue of regulation online spaces for a very good reason. You have lots of different regulators doing different things, not always talking to themselves in the best way. So they've established something called the I think it's the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum or something like this, which basically creates a duty for all of these organizations to be talking to each other on a regular basis. You know, I think that could actually go a little bit further, and actually you could think about how do you formalize that objective and as almost a KPI for all of those regulators that they have to answer to, so that, you know, because to your point, you know, regulation is more effective when there's a clear frameworks that everybody understands. I don't think complexity and lots of different pieces of regulation or regulators working in different areas actually favors consumers or companies.
Easier to comply with as well.
Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about the way that your public policy team's set up. How big's your trust and safety team, whatever that is defined as inside Trust globally, and how many of those resources are based in Australia?
So we prefer not to talk publicly about the size of our trust and safety team, and I can kind of give a bit of information as to why. You know, you've mentioned that Snap is still a significantly smaller company than some of the largest players in this space. What we really want to focus on, and I guess be measured against, and what we're always trying to be as transparent as possible about, is the quality and the effectiveness of the content moderation services that we provide. And, you know, I mentioned how we currently go further than any other platform in terms of our transparency report for how we deal with harmful content and activity in Australia. You know, and the media, we detail the median turnaround times for responding to reports there. I think kind of questions about specifically how many people we have in individual countries around the world is not the best indicator of how we're doing that job, and that's just why we've never talked about that figure publicly.
I suppose part of the reason that I asked that is that there are culturally specific issues in different countries, different markets, different jurisdictions that can be, you know, misinterpreted, neglected, not understood without that kind of domestic perspective.
Yeah, and I don't want to give the impression that there's nobody thinking about these issues in Australia. The model that we have, and we have people around the world, vendors and Snap staff around the world who focus on these issues, is that they receive training on local issues, contextual things, language elements, which is less of an issue in Australia than it is in some other countries, but that enables them to do that job really effectively in all of the countries in which we operate. And obviously having policy staff like myself based in the country as well, I'm involved in those conversations as well. So that's kind of how we approach it.
And one of the things that I've been exploring with all the platforms is how you structure those sort of trust and safety or integrity roles within the broader organisation. So I've spoken to YouTube, for example, about the fact that their product team and their trust and integrity team report to the same person. They insist that that's not a conflict. How does Snap think about those functions? Are they distinct in the company? Are they the sort of product and policy, or product and trust and safety teams, are they under the same hat? How do you manage conflicts in objectives between those groups?
So they're distinct in ways, but there's also lots of kind of dotted lines, I would say, between the two. So our platform integrity team, which encompasses trust and safety and law enforcement operations, they actually report through to our sort of head of engineering at Snap. So I think in a kind of similar way, thinking, the feeling there is that you can apply that technical experience and know-how to some of those issues around safety and privacy. But we also have, within the policy team at Snap, we have a platform safety policy lead, which is headed up by a very senior person within our team. Their job is, and our internal platform policy team, their job is, they're constantly speaking to our colleagues at Platform Integrity to design our internal policies and processes, to inform those safety by design processes that I was talking about, to inform our outreach to safety organizations or regulators, and then to bring that back into the design process. And in market people like myself as well, there's not a formal structure, but I'm constantly talking to my colleagues in trust and safety and law enforcement operations, for example, as well as those colleagues within the policy team.
But there aren't individuals that have sort of conflicting short-term incentives, for example, on, product use or expansion compared to, trust and safety outcomes.
I think the fact that platform integrity is now, is part of our engineering team, you're never going to be able to totally, every organization, I'm sure, whether a government department or a company, will occasionally have some differences of opinion. But I think the fact that you have safety really embedded into our engineering function helps us to address those issues earlier on. And I think also just the importance of processes as well as structures. So those the safety by design program that we have, the privacy design program that we have, these aren't just buzzwords. These are things that are embedded into the design and development of any new product and feature that we have. And I do think that's tangibly reflected in a service that is different from some of the other kind of platforms.
Just pivoting back to this regulatory complexity issue. In your submission, you talk about encouraging the government to look for opportunities to simplify and rationalise the landscape around one central and comprehensive regulatory framework similar to the models being developed in the EU and the UK. Can you elaborate for the committee about what elements of the EU and UK frameworks you'd endorse in this respect?
Yeah, and I can talk. Most of my experience in this space is in the UK, so maybe I can talk a little bit about that. Although I think it has moved a little bit away from the kind of central model that I thought was so effective some years ago. But the online safety bill in the UK has a core idea of you have a statutory duty of care to for platforms to take responsibility for the safety of their users. And that's one. Within that, you have sort of outcomes focused regulation. So you empower an independent regulator to look at how platforms are complying with their duty of care. How are they ensuring the safety of users? How are they preventing young people from accessing a service? How are they achieving these various obligations? But they're allowed to do that. Flexibility is built into the model, so it respects the fact that Snapchat might approach something very differently from Facebook or from TikTok, for example, and it allows for that. And smaller companies might approach it even still more differently. It allows for that flexibility, but ultimately you have to answer to the regulator and you have to demonstrate that you are meeting the objective in a way that's appropriate to your service. So that kind of flexibility is built in. And when we talk about principles-based regulation in the submission or outcomes-based regulation, that's kind of what we're talking about. I noticed that you had Damien Collins and Lorna Woods and some other people in front of the committee. I do think that unfortunately the online safety bill in the UK has evolved quite significantly, and I think maybe this is a result of just the political focus that there is on the bill in the UK, but it has kind of moved pretty far along, I think, from that central idea of a duty of care. The new framework, as far as I can see, presents a pretty huge compliance burden for companies of all sizes. So there's large numbers of different processes in there, risk assessments, multiple different codes of practice that apply, as far as I can see, regardless of the size of the company. And the overwhelming impression for me is actually the creation of a lot of process rather than anything that actually ensures that users are safer. And we've talked a bit today about how really granular regulation just actually favors the largest companies, who in many cases have been the inspiration for this. So I do think that the core model in the UK, the core of that model is still the right one, but I think it's also a bit of a sort of instructive story for governments around the world of how regulation in an area that's so politically contested and so high profile can kind of evolve and develop.
And the core of that regime is the statutory duty.
Yeah, exactly.
So from your perspective, moving into the Australian market, how does that statutory duty in the UK context compare to the basic online safety expectation? How do those approaches differ? And what are the things that we should be alert to as these codes are developed under the BOS?
So I actually think that the basic online safety expectations have a lot of that in them, in that they set key expectations for companies, but they are, it is, in a sense, it is a duty of care, right? Like key expectations of how you're ensuring the safety of your users, but they're principles based. They're not granular. It's very explicit, actually, the paper, that you need to have flexibility built into that model. And I think really that's the core of a good, effective online safety regime wherever you are. I think there's scope to potentially, I have to confess, I don't fully understand the categories of harm that are reflected in the Australian regime. And I think there's scope to potentially broaden that out and maybe pull some of those other elements of legislation in. We're working on the codes right now. So Digi and various trade associations are leading that negotiation process on the codes with the eSafety Commissioner. And I think the eSafety Commissioner understands, if you read their position paper, like it's quite clear that regulation should be flexible. Like, I'm just wary, having seen a lot of codes process develop around in countries around the world, I'm a little wary of that process, of how it can quickly move into something that is a lot more granular and prescriptive and less flexible. So I'm hoping that won't be the case here in Australia.
And just sort of drawing out on that answer, one of the differences between the statutory duty being proposed in the UK context and the BOS at the moment is the scope of the harms that are being sought to address. So in Australia, it's individualised harms under the Online Safety Act is the focus, not broader harms to, say, groups of individuals or social cohesion or trust in democracy or whatever. Broader type harms aren't encompassed by the BOS.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And like, that is it is a really challenging area, right? And I don't think anybody has necessarily got the, in the UK at the moment, there's a lot of debate around what obligations should there be around legal but harmful, right? Whereas I think in the EU, they've landed on this, concept of what is illegal offline should be illegal online. I think if you're sticking with parameters around what's legal and illegal, it's a simpler regulatory framework, and there's a lot of challenges when you get to that wider behavior. It's not to say that they shouldn't seek to address it, it's just a difficult subject.
Okay. I know that the chair has a few more questions, so I might just cede the rest of my time to allow the chair just to explore that before our next witness.
Sure thing. Thank you.
Thank you for attending today.
having some challenges with the buttons. I appreciate, it's funny, I'm grappling a little bit, Mr. Turnbull, because I actually very much appreciate what you're saying. I just feel like structurally, you know, we've actually got some challenges by nature of the fact that technology is being used to facilitate behaviour that can sometimes, you know, can be only classified as abusive, abhorrent,
Yes.
legal sometimes, depending on the nature of what we're talking about. Is it really... Is it really, sorry, I wasn't quite ready to ask some of these questions, but that's okay. Is it, in your view, what would be 3 simple actions that this committee could take that would set a standard to reduce online harm and abuse?
Could I possibly ask to take that question on
Yep.
on notice? Because I feel like
Yep.
it's an important question. It deserves a bit of time just to think about the answers.
I'm conscious that, you know, we're asking, you know, this is not just an Australian, it's not just an Australian, it's not just used in Australia, it's used right around the world, and I'm very cognizant of that. But you're right, technology is evolving. Like, you know, this is iterative, where it's an ongoing process. You were talking about the UK experience. It is iterative, but I just come back to the fundamentals of, I mean, the good thing is you're looking at safety by design, but we still have a challenge that technology itself is being used for unsafe behaviours and is facilitating unsafe behaviours. And as much as I'm looking at what you've put, like, outlined, I completely agree, these behaviours are still occurring. So we could, you know, potentially put things under one umbrella. I don't know if that would keep people safe, that if that would add to safety or simply simplify some of the existing requirements.
I think the two things go hand in hand. If you don't, particularly just given that, you've got to bear in mind that the enormous variety that exists in the size, the service models, the resources of different online platforms, you know, and particularly for the you know, who knows what the new platform of, you know, the next month is going to be. None of us do, and the situation evolves so quickly, and often these companies won't have enormous teams or won't have thought very deeply about these issues, you know, at the very start of the very conception of their platform. So I think having as much clarity as possible about what is expected of you, understanding your obligations, having a flexible framework, like, these are all things that just make it easier for companies to comply, make it easier for them to think about safety, and thus make it easier to ensure that people are actually safer online as a result. And I think it's also improves clarity for the government about what you're expecting from platforms. It makes regulators' job easier. It makes law enforcement job easier. It actually makes it easier for consumers as well to understand their rights. So I hope when I'm talking about simplifying or rationalizing regulation, it doesn't sound too self-interested. It's about trying to create a more effective framework for everybody, I think.
Yeah, because the missing bit for me, I think you've helped clarify this. The missing bit for me is you can look at technology and a technology-centered approach for safety by design. And what you've outlined seems to me to be a technology-centered approach for safety by design, which is commendable. You can look at the regulatory framework that we've talked about and the simplification there. But I think where I'm getting to, and maybe it's just being a mum, maybe it's being a parent, maybe it's talking the lived practical experience of what's actually happening out there in the real world, the everyday world for users. That might be the missing bit. And how do we actually join and connect those dots such that there is true safety by design in the sense of user safety, as well as simply the technology, the inbuilt technology designed to minimize. You've still got individuals who are doing the wrong thing. I take that. But when that happens, you know, are there additional steps, or is there a gap that we've got here? And if so, what might we be able to do in the real world, to particularly for young Australians, particularly for young people, to make them safer online? And that remains the fundamental question, because it's a practical, real world one, largely talking about use, practical use of it, that is happening outside of all of the technology-focused safety features that you've built in. That's the challenge, I think.
I think you make a really good point that you can't consider technology in isolation of how human beings actually interact with services and how they behave. And, you know, at Snap, we do conduct a lot of research to try and understand how people are using the platform, how they feel about the platform, and to try and use that to inform what we do as a response. So I won't go into too much detail, but we did a big program of research a couple of years ago that basically looked at people's mental health in relation to different online platforms, including Snap, and how young people, particularly these days, are struggling with sort of stress and anxiety, I think, in maybe ways that wasn't the case in previous years. What that research told us is that friends are often considered to be like the first person that you'll speak to if you're a young person, rather than necessarily your parents or your therapist. And as a platform that's like mainly designed for close friends, we did feel that we had a kind of role to play there. So we launched a feature called Here For You as a result of that, which essentially, if you search for a harmful term within Snapchat, so if you search for like self-harm or suicide or something within the app, rather than linking to user-generated content that might be, you know, concerning or ill thought out, that actually directs you through to content that's been designed with specialist NGOs around the world to provide resources and advice for people who might be questioned, to support friends to have those conversations with their friends, and that also links through to resources provided by those organizations. So there's more that we can do in that space. We've got a big program of research coming this year, which hopefully we can act on in the same way that we did there. But I totally hear you, and I think listening to young people's, or people of all kinds, experience with online platforms is a critical, and what they're actually doing and the kind of behavior that they're taking part in is a pretty critical element of all of us, whether it's government or platforms, thinking about how we respond to these issues.
I take your point, and that's actually helping me to go a little bit further. If I go back to practical real world examples, so a young 20-something or other was sharing, you know, a very practical experience where some revenge images were put up and shared, and she's literally sitting next to her friend as these things are going up on Snapchat. So just as an example, when somebody reports, you've already outlined, so I'm just thinking some practical things. When somebody reports, you've already outlined that it's easy to do that. What is the action? What's the practical action that Snap would take, say, of an instance like that where images have been shared without consent, it's not appropriate, this person's under the age of 18? Does the person who shared, the account who shared the images get banned? What practical action actually happens from something like that? If I just talk practical steps, this has happened to somebody I know, what is actually the practical outworking of a report?
Yeah, so it's a good question. There are a range of actions that we take depending on that the team will take depending on the context around the report and the severity of the harm in question. So when they review a user report and it's found to violate our community guidelines, there are a kind of cascading range of actions. You can either just remove the content in question, you can issue a warning to the violating account, you can delete the violating account, you can block, you know, we're getting further down the list, you can block the device associated with the account so it prevents the person creating a new one. And then for specific kind of the most severe types of harmful content, particularly when you're thinking about child sexual abuse material, that sort of thing, reporting to the US-based National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who then coordinates with law enforcement as appropriate, including in Australia. So that's kind of the gamut of options that you would have. I have to say, I'm not part of those moderation decisions, so I don't know exactly how the team would respond in every instance, but the kind of behavior that you're talking about is, is severe and severe harmful activity. And I think that the penalties for that would be severe.
Do young people know that there are severe penalties? Do young people using your platform know there are severe penalties for some of the inappropriate content or content that's shared online.
So we're always
Is that awareness created?
So we're always looking for ways to increase awareness with our community guidelines and the associated penalties. So I think anybody who signs up to create a Snapchat account is you see the community guidelines and agree to them in order to use the platform. Also, when people have, we've been experimenting more and more with, if you have your account reported for any reason and the team upholds that, you will actually you'll be made to look at our community guidelines again and understand them and understand the sort of penalties involved. So we are, and I know this is something that regulators around the world are thinking about as well. How do you raise awareness of those guidelines? This is something that we're thinking about new and creative ways to do it. I mentioned that safety snapshot channel that we have that kind of puts some of this information up in a way that's intended to be more accessible for young people and less kind of serious, but still makes them aware of this serious issue. So, you know, we'll take any ideas as well from safety organizations, governments, your committee on these kind of issues as well, because there's more we can do to raise that awareness for sure.
I'd be really interested in, and I know that we only have a very short turnaround time frame. So firstly, I just want to say thank you for agreeing to take some of my questions on notice and to come back, because that's a very short time frame that we have to do that. But I think it's actually a really important one, particularly given, as I said, you have actually, your company has considered the concept of safety by design, and you're sort of standing by that. I guess, and I'm not sort of predicating the way forward here, but I just look at, so for instance, today I opened Instagram and there's a story from the Daily Telly about a young 15-year-old who took her life after a whole lot of bullying, including cyberbullying. And, you know, it's heartbreaking. You read this, you look at it's actually heartbreaking. You know, for not being invited to parties, to having fake nudes spread on social media, is the comment. And then her parents saying, we want to do everything we can to make sure no other little humans go through this. And I think that's the point that I'm coming from. What do we do to make sure no other little humans go through this? And I'm not saying that this occurred on your platform at all. I'm not aware of the background of it, but I do think that this concept of, is there, what more can we do in these instances that is reasonable, of course, but is there further, and do you have further suggestions as to what we can do with that, what I call that gap? You know, the gap between the technology-centered approach to safety by design, the regulatory approach over here, and then the gap about the real-world experience of little humans, you know, and particularly, I'm thinking particularly young people, but really, you know, it could be extrapolated. It could be extrapolated further.
And just to address that, though, because I know we're nearly out of time, but just to address the Telegraph story, because I also saw that this morning, and I just wanted to say how sorry I am for the Rosewarne family's loss. I can't imagine they're going through right now, and I think unfortunately that case highlights, you know, I've talked about some of the measures that we have to put in place that prohibit anonymous abuse and make it very difficult to abuse somebody anonymously, and unfortunately that case I think highlights how bullying and abuse can often take place among people who know each other really well in real life and who are ostensibly friends or schoolmates.
That's right.
And
yeah.
It is a real challenge across a whole bunch of different areas. But we'll certainly look at those questions that you raised. But also thank you for your time today and for giving me the opportunity to speak to you about these issues.
Yeah, no, thank you. We very much appreciate just I guess a thoughtful response as to what areas, practically speaking, could be looked at in regards to that. And Mr. Turnbull, I just want to thank you for your time and for your willingness to provide that time and your responses to the committee. We very much appreciate it. We appreciate your willingness to provide further information. I know that takes time out of your busy schedule, so thank you very much for that. And if you could please forward that additional information to the Secretary by the 9th of March 2022 to advise you that you'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and you'll have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. Thank you very much for your time and attendance here today.
Thank you very much, Chair and Deputy Chair. Thank you.
I believe we have Mr. Levy online from Family Zone. Okay. I'll just check with the Secretariat. We're good to go? Okay. I now call witnesses and welcome witnesses of Family Zone to provide evidence today and ask that for the Hansard record for you to please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee.
Timothy Levy, Managing Director of Family Zone Cyber Safety Limited.
Thank you. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I'd just like to invite you to provide a brief opening statement before we move to discussion and questions from the committee.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for the committee for the work that you do. This is incredibly important, and for the opportunity to speak. Hopefully you can hear me, and look, I'll just 5 or 10 minutes of introduction, if you will. A bit about our company. So Family Zone was launched in 2013 by a group of Australian parents, really, who were concerned about the unmoderated access of kids to materials online. And we felt we were undermined, disempowered by the tools that are available to keep our kids safe. Our kids became compulsive users of technology and were stumbling upon inadvertently, even at very young ages, materials that just weren't appropriate, and were learning things way ahead of time. And so we set ourselves a mission to provide, hopefully, and what we're still seeing as the world's first solution, truly universal solution to keep kids safe everywhere. And in fact, what we see our mission as is supporting the custodians of a child's digital journey. And that might be mum and dad in a typical home, or it might be in a split family, or it might be the administrator of a school, or a teacher in a modern classroom, or a boarding school manager. You name it, there are a lot of people involved in a child's digital journey, and all of them are disempowered today. And what we're trying to do is build a singular approach to support all of them with technology and the advice of experts, really embed advice and insight into our way of doing business. Now, we've only been on that journey for 6-7 years, and it's hard. It's really challenging. And because of our approach, which is supporting the needs of parents and schools, we've got a very unique insight into these challenges. We support currently something like 20,000 schools on our platforms, 11 million kids. When we made a submission to this committee, we had only 10 million students on our platform. It's now 11. We're growing incredibly quickly. What that insight gives us is that we see the amazing array of tools that are made available to businesses, to government agencies and schools to protect users, that aren't made available to parents. And that's appalling. So I can provide, my company and everyone in my industry can provide an outstanding service to protect the fidelity of information and protect what the users of that associated with that enterprise can do, and the ability of those users to bypass those controls. We can do that in an outstanding way across all platforms, Android devices, iPhones, you name it. But we're not allowed to do that for parents. I'm not allowed, to make that clear, I'm not allowed to protect kids to the same level I'm allowed to protect and breach the privacy, if you think about it, of adults. And that's a deliberate choice, unfortunately. It's a deliberate commercial choice of big tech, of Google, Apple, and Microsoft. Their policies allow kids to bypass parental controls, deliberately limit the ability of parental control providers to provide a service to parents. And I've seen some of the submissions to this committee, and the horrifying stories of the impact of what kids can see online. And what saddens me is it's the commercial choices of big tech, particularly those that are often not mentioned in these circles, but Google, Apple, and Microsoft, who are really controlling the gate, the access to the internet. They're the ones that I feel are, well, in fact, I'm very strongly of the view, are the ones that are undermining parents. And that's really the thesis of, the key kind of point that we made in our submission, which is I think that is the key area of that requires attention of bodies like this, and in particular needs regulatory intervention. Now, I won't go on too much longer, but one point I'd like to make is I often hear comments like, you know, parents don't step up, and or parents need to be educated. And that is true. I'm not saying that's not true, but in my experience, armed with appropriate tools, and particularly with the influence of schools, parents do step up. We've got many schools in Australia where more than 80-90% of parents have stepped up and actually been actively involved in their child's online safety. Schools in New Zealand that work with us that have got 100% of parents using parental controls after school. So it's not a function of parents' willingness, in my experience, and we've got a lot of experience in this. It's when parents step into it, and our submission touched on this, it is so unbelievably difficult. You've got so many risk vectors, so many different devices, all with different abilities to protect your children. None of it interoperates. It's such an impossible challenge. And when you're faced with that level of difficulty and a screaming 13-year-old, I'm sad to say the screaming 13-year-old wins. And the churn in our industry, churn is the cancellation of services. It's really bad. Like the best parental control provider in the world has churn of about 40% per year. The typical churn, cancellation rate of parental control products is 80% per year, because parents install the app on their kid's iPhone thinking this will do a good job, and the kid removes it instantly. And they have this battle about, well, give me the PIN, let me reinstall the app. And that's the reality of parental controls today. And unfortunately, that is not, frustratingly, that's not the experience that schools have when they deploy technology on devices, or business when they deploy that same sort of technology on devices. The users can't remove it. The technology performs better. So these are definitely the deliberate choices of big tech that get in the way of parents' right and actual willingness, in our experience, to make an impact in their kids' online lives. And just quickly touching on the regulatory inquiries, the digital platforms inquiry, very welcome a piece of work from the ACCC. I'm really glad that they're doing that. I know it's a long tail project, and the inquiry into the operation of the app stores was outstanding, because it really documented what we've been hanging on about for a long time, which is the kind of the abuse of market power of in particular Apple and Google around app stores and operating systems. So it identified what we've been talking about, which is self-preferencing, the ability to prefer different markets and to prefer first-party apps. And that's really the problem that our industry is facing. Is what our industry is trying to do is help parents enforce, I guess, the complete opposite of what Google and Apple and Microsoft want, which is engaged users, or otherwise known as addicted users. So we're kind of the antithesis of their business model, and they use various means, fair and foul, to corrupt what we're trying to achieve. That was clearly identified by the DPI report. What is a little bit frustrating is the DPI report steps short, slightly short of recommending regulatory intervention to actually force open access and interoperability. But fortunately, in the US, what's it called? It's called the American Innovation Act has been proposed, and it explicitly would seek to stop that behaviour, explicitly make it unlawful for these big tech companies to preference their first-party apps, to preference certain marketplaces. It's exactly the regulations that Australia should have. Australia should be leading the way on this, like we do in so many other areas of regulatory reform. I think our Australian kids are worth it, and I really hope that this committee recommends action in that area in particular.
Thanks very much for those opening comments. In your statement to the committee, your submission, you talked about gaming accounts, and it is interesting. I can completely relate, by the way, to what you're saying in relation to parental controls and how challenging that can be. And it's great. I don't have the tussle. We've got very strong engagement, but I have a fatigue about keeping up. It's just probably the lived experience of, keeping up with what's going on. I think you're absolutely right. Young people wanting to sort of join these apps often well before the age limit, and I'm the mean, nasty parent saying no. But it is hard. I completely agree with you there. And it's not just social media, it's online gaming as well. The game, the games they play, and I think you've mentioned this, Fortnite, Minecraft, that we've heard about ever since pretty much kids almost go to school, you start hearing about these games, very, very young. And, you've indicated that they are key social environments for our children, I'd agree, and the home of much of the online behavioural issues and challenges. It's an interesting area that we haven't had a lot of exploration in. I'm just wondering if you can provide a bit of an outline as to some of the concerns and, is there a better approach, or is this something part of what the committee should be considering? If so, what would that look like?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it touches on something that I've definitely noticed in debates around online safety. Is so much of the attention is put on Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and so on. And look, don't get me wrong, there's an enormous amount of toxicity in those platforms. But what we also find is the the bigger the platform, the more scrutinised it is by regulatory bodies in the media, the kind of more responsible they are. And so as bad as Facebook is, and there's plenty of evidence for that, it is clean as compared to some of the other apps that my kids are even trying to use. Think of Omegle and Ask FM and apps that you probably never heard of, let alone in the gaming. Right, well, Omegle will frighten you. And Telegram, even Telegram, which has blown up in the last week. I think there's millions of users have been added to Telegram in the last week since the Ukrainian invasion, and that would horrify you. It's essentially it's a place where Australian kids buy drugs, and that app has blown up in Australia. So there's so much of the stuff not far beneath the surface where the real malevolent behaviour and real risks occur, and it seems to be ignored in so much of these debates on online safety. And gaming's a great example of that. Even the big name gaming apps like Fortnite and even Minecraft, they open kids up to communication with people that they don't know. And parents are by and large disempowered from fixing that. You can pick, in gaming platforms, age maturity levels for your children, but you don't know what that means. That is not clear to you as a parent what that maturity level means and what it does and does not allow your child to access. It's an afterthought. Parental controls in the gaming world is an absolute afterthought. But I think the solution here is essentially the same, which is there needs to be access control gateways by independent providers of software, which already exist in the business world, which allow the imposition of maturity level gates into these platforms. That's where I'd really like the E-Safety Commission to be working globally on, well, for a 13-year-old or for this level of maturity, these are the sorts of features that should be available in social media and gaming platforms. And then you need parental control technology, either first party or third party, that sits there at the gate and says, well, this user's 13 and therefore they should have access to these levels of features. And the thing is, that's not an abstract concept. Those technologies exist today. They're being used by businesses today. They should just be made available to consumers. I think it's an area of real concern that's not getting enough attention. It's much like gaming for kids, gambling for kids, is just not getting enough attention.
You've indicated, we just talked about Omegle before, significant rise of children using what you've described as more risky apps like Telegram, Omegle, I think that's how you say it, Snapchat, and Reddit. Why are they more risky, and what, in your view, what more needs to be done there? Well,
so Omegle is most known as a place where teenagers will, I'm not sure what's the appropriate way to say this, is to basically get, share, not just share nudes, but share nude videos, right, to essentially masturbate in front of each other. That's what it's known as. Telegram is very much known as a place where you can join kind of subgroups, dangerous groups, and in particular groups associated with illegal activity and drug use. They're there, and even if you lock those ones down, new ones will evolve. The internet metastasizes. It's a very dynamic place, and that's why these gates are so important. Parents need the ability to put technology on their device, either Apple technology or a family's own technology or a Norton technology that the kids can't remove, and that applies the rule that if this app is unknown to mum and dad, it can't be used. That's how you defeat those issues. So I'm happy with my 12 and 14-year-old kids using Facebook. All they're going to see is boring photos of, boring photos of old people in Facebook. Happy with my kids to be in Facebook. But I don't want big tech to make the decisions about whether my kids can access Snapchat and Omegle and Ask FM and so on. So it's having effective gates on the device, and it has to be on the device. You can't protect kids by thinking you're going to be putting filtering in the telco networks. That stuff doesn't work with today's encryption. It just literally does not work. So it has to be technology on the device that is the gatekeeper. Parents need to have the confidence that technology is there, only allowing the kids to access the things that they're comfortable with.
And what is the current impediment to doing that?
It's that Google, Apple, and Microsoft don't allow the parental control apps to be put on these devices in a secure way.
Right, around the world or just in Australia?
Everywhere.
What would be required to allow that change of company policy, or is there further, are you proposing something?
Those organisations could change their policies tomorrow to allow it. The technology exists, it's used by businesses already. So it's just a policy decision by those groups.
Thank you. There's a range of questions that I'm just thinking through, sorry, as a result of some of the conversation we're having. You have mentioned about algorithms in your submission. And you've noted children's brains are not sufficiently developed to defend against the sophistication of these algorithms. As somebody who's interested in, child and maturity development, I just say I'll take your point. But what do you think needs to be done about this? Is this a deliberate sort of content or algorithm, age-related algorithm policy approach, or how do you think this should be addressed by platforms?
Okay. Well, firstly, I think the fundamental, I think things around behaviour, things around algorithms and the manipulation of users online, none of those will get addressed unless we deal with the gate, right? So think about it like a swimming pool. If we want to protect our kids from drowning or being beaten up in a swimming pool, you don't want them to get into that pool. But once they're in the pool, like, all bets are off. Like, it's really hard to protect them. And that's what we're talking about here. Unless parents have effective tools to stop their kids getting into environments where those methods are at large, we're in a cat and mouse game or a whack-a-mole game, as I think I just suggest in that submission. So it's what's the right word? It's definitely compelling. It's definitely easy to get kind of sucked into conversations about, well, let's beat up Facebook about their algorithms. But that won't get this problem fixed. What's required is that parents need effective tools to stop their kids getting into places where they can be harmed. Now, having said that, on the algorithms, what worries me is that they are completely automated and incredibly powerful at identifying what elicits the relevant response for that user's activity. Incredibly powerful, and not just at affecting kids' behaviour, but even adult behaviour. Look at the performance of TikTok over the last few years. It is phenomenal, and that's all based on those algorithms that work out who you are and what you like, and seed you ever new and more interesting and risky content. Look, it's a big problem. It can only be, again, addressed by having control of the gates, parental control app type features, and then again, regulatory bodies globally setting standards for what these maturity levels for what sort of technology can be made available. And then you need the gatekeepers, the technology that can, for kids of certain age, only introduce into that technology when required. So it's the same. It's all problematic stuff. It's in my mind not entirely different to the problems of all the sort of difficult content and services you see online, you need good gates. Parents need to be able to control what their kids can access.
If I put a counter argument for a moment, though,
Sure.
ought not the platforms be doing this to some degree themselves?
Of course.
In other words, if we took safety by design as a fundamental concept, there's a lot where it seems as though we talk about educating young people, we talk about educating users, we talk about that there's the requirement to sign up to these community safety standards, and so there's the assumption, the expectation is then put on by the social media platform onto the user that they comply. Talk about parental controls, all of which are very valid and very, very important. But some of this is happening because the content and the harmful material is there in the first place and that technology that's enabling that, it wasn't there sort of 30 years ago. We weren't dealing with these sorts of things. So given it's a technology that to some degree is enabling this, what recommendations would you make around the platforms themselves taking on more of this, taking on some of what you're suggesting, and what would that look like?
Look, I certainly think the idea of safety by design is powerful, and I'm not saying for a minute that these online social media and gaming platforms shouldn't be circumspect about how they use these tools. All I'm saying is that relying on that is resisting gravity, right? It's not in their interests to be ahead of regulatory thoughts or community concerns on these things. It's not in their interests at all. The recent crash of Facebook, share price dropping by 26%, should be a big concern to regulators globally, because they're going to be even less inclined to be thinking about moderating behaviour. It's just not in their interest, so they're going to push back. And also remember that TikTok didn't exist 5 years ago, and so those new apps that are getting our kids, consuming our kids and addicting our kids, that's the last things they're going to be thinking about is safety by design as they roll out their features and try and create an audience so they can raise money or generate advertising dollars. So I'm not saying any of these things are bad to do. I'm just saying that they're going to be ineffective unless you've got the ability for parents to say, well, unless this app, gaming platform, social media platform is compliant with e-safety standards, I don't want my kid to do it. That's the only way this is going to be effective. Good standards and effective controls. There is no safety measure globally that is effective without robust choices of the community to actually enforce it. Think about drug policy, right? Drug policy of just saying, hoping that people don't do drugs doesn't work. You need enforcement mechanisms. You need effective actual choices. So I see the same thing. All those things are good. Standards are really important, but parents need the ability to enforce them.
When you look at enforcement, though, if I go back to one of the conversations I had earlier in an earlier public hearing, where as we were having a conversation with a witness, I was reminded of a particular policy that was around on the Central Coast for pubs and clubs, and where they got together and they created a ban from one, ban from all. In other words, you do this behaviour here and you get kicked out. You'd be kicked out from all of them for a period of time, for however long that ban is in force. A very effective deterrent. And that's, I come back to, do you think more can be done? And, I take your point about parental controls. I understand that absolutely, taking that, if you like, as read. But I still come down to, should there not be more at the get-go? If you've got a playground, if you've got a swimming pool, I think you were referring to a swimming pool, there's certain safety standards around that. You've then got requirement for parental supervision of that swimming pool, etc. So, but there's an inbuilt safety feature already in the swimming pool, as you know, with the fences and the this and the that. So if you go back to that, what additional fencing needs to be had for young people on some of these social media platforms? I guess my question is the consequences when you're reported for violating community policy and the standards policy? Is that sufficient at the moment? Should it be stricter? Is there more that can be done there? Or do you really think there's no confidence, we're going to have to go to parental control and a gateway approach?
Well, I don't think there is any alternative but a gateway approach, giving effective choice to parents. And the example you give is a good example, because it is in the interest of those publicans that there is good behaviour in and around their community. They make no additional money. It is not in their financial interest of gangsters or violent behaviour in their establishments or within their community. But it's the complete opposite with social media. It's in their interests that there is malevolent behaviour. That's what attracts kids. It's the risky stuff. That's the good stuff. That's the gravy. So it's resisting gravity. You need standards. They should be under high levels of scrutiny. One of the problems with the Online Safety Act is it's just a name and shame. There's no real penalty for these organisations, but there should be. And takedown notices should be instantaneous, not 24 hours or whatever that time frame is. So absolutely, we should increase the heat on these guys, these organisations. But again, I keep coming back to the issues are so much broader than the eSafety Commissioner can handle by going organisation by organisation by organisation. We need to democratise safety, and that comes down to giving the community effective choices that businesses have today that parents do not have. But you just can't argue that parents shouldn't have the ability to say, well, my kid's not allowed to use Snapchat. Why can't they do that? And yet that power is being taken out of their hands. That's just not acceptable.
You mentioned the Online Safety Act. Does that act have any impact on your work and your organisation?
No, not really. Look, it's a good start, I think, for the government. But no, we're not. Interestingly, our industry isn't actually covered by that act, which is a bit strange, and nor is Google, Apple, and Microsoft, which I think's very strange. They're the most influential when it comes to online activity, and they're not a segment that's currently involved. So I think those are two areas that need to be fixed.
Did you have any engagement with the government during the bill's process, development, feedback, input?
We made some submissions, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right. Are there any sort of other final comments or observations you would make in relation to what the Australian government could do to help improve safety for children and support parents, in addition to what you've already outlined?
No, not in terms of what I've outlined. I think everyone is quite clear on what we think is going to make the biggest impact. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your attendance here and for your time, as well as your evidence, and just to express our appreciation to you for being here today. If there's any additional information that is requested of you, would you please provide that to the Secretary by the 9th of March 2022 to advise you that you'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and you'll have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. Thank you again for attending. We very much appreciate it. And I'll just indicate that the committee is adjourned until 4:15 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank our witnesses for being present today. We do appreciate it. Thank you for returning a second time at short notice. We would just like to, on behalf of the committee, I extend my thanks and appreciation to you and welcome you to give evidence today, representatives of Meta, and ask that for the Hansard record for you to please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee.
Chair, my name is Mia Garlick and I'm the Director of Policy for Meta across Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific Islands. And if we may, we did want to have a brief opening statement just to give you some updates on some developments since we last appeared. But
that's fine. We'll go through formalities first, then I'll definitely throw to you. Thank you very much, Ms. Garlick. Mr. Machin.
Thanks very much, Chair. I'm Josh Machin, Meta's Head of Public Policy in Australia.
Thank you very much. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. As indicated earlier, I'll invite you to make a brief opening statement and then we'll proceed to discussions and questions with the committee.
Thank you, Chair. Much appreciated. And as I mentioned, there have been a number of developments since we last appeared, and we just thought it would be helpful to share those with the committee, just in case it's of interest and relevance to your ongoing work on these issues. But obviously, before turning to some of our key points, we did want to just pause and acknowledge the devastating impact of the flooding, particularly around Eastern Australia right now. And just, I know many of the constituents of members of this committee have been badly impacted, and we just wanted to share that our thoughts are with everyone affected, and obviously acknowledge that to the extent that the internet has been available, many members of the community have been using our services to check in on loved ones, to let friends and family know they're safe, and to coordinate rescue and support initiatives. The community has activated the Facebook crisis response tool for the Northern New South Wales floods. One of the local mental health groups that we work with has used ad credits to make sure that they're able to get messages to people that their services are still available, even if their offices are underwater. And obviously we're looking at what more we can do. But I guess the learning and the insight from this, it's not just with the accelerated digitisation of our society through the pandemic, but also looking at the way technology is supporting communities through times of disaster, as is happening now. Obviously, technology is playing such a crucial and important role in our lives, and I guess that's why we're grateful for the opportunity to talk with policymakers such as yourselves about the very legitimate questions you have about the impact of technology and the decision-making and accountability of companies such as Meta. I want to reassure you that governments, industry and community have the same objectives here, and that is ensuring the safe, positive and intentional use of digital services and ensuring that technology companies such as Meta are transparent and accountable. Since we appeared before this committee a month ago, we've made further data and insights about our services available. Firstly, we've released our January 2022 Coordinated Inauthentic Behaviour Report that detailed a network that originated in St. Petersburg, Russia, and targeted multiple countries in Africa. And we've shared information about our findings with law enforcement, policymakers and peers to make sure that people can analyse these findings further. Yesterday, we released the next tranche of our transparency reports. So that's our community standards enforcement report for the fourth quarter of 2021. We've released the next quarterly update on our progress in implementing the Oversight Board's decisions and recommendations, and the latest widely viewed content report. In February 2022, we introduced system cards to the public. That's a tool that shows how an artificial intelligence system, a group of machine learning models and other AI and non-AI techniques work together to accomplish a specific task. And the first system card focuses on how Instagram ranks posts in feed. Here in Australia, since we last met, we've partnered with the Butterfly Foundation to launch the Body Kind online campaign that combined clinically backed advice from the Butterfly Foundation with tips from creators to help young Australians navigate a safer and more positive body image experience on social media, including Instagram. Whilst there continue to be new developments, we know that there is more to do. We recognise that more is needed to provide confidence in the steps that companies such as Meta is taking to keep people safe. That's why since 2019, we've been calling for new rules for the internet, including here in Australia. For example, we were one of the first companies to publicly endorse the Safety Commissioner's Safety by Design guidelines. We were a critical driver in landing a world-leading industry code on misinformation and disinformation, and we supported the government's Online Safety Act, which came into effect earlier this year. We're committed to being a constructive partner to Australian policymakers in designing, implementing the effectiveness of new laws. And to assist the committee, we've provided a comprehensive submission on the many topics that were raised in the terms of reference, and also are grateful for the opportunity to appear before you for a second time. So in that vein, thank you again for the opportunity to meet and answer your questions, and we look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. We have a number of questions from the committee, and I'll just flag in advance that this may go over the allotted hour. And thank you for making your time available. I'll throw first to the Deputy Chair, then myself, then Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Chair. I thought that I might pick up where we left off on some of the questions on notice answers that you provided, particularly in the context of mis and disinformation in the context of the upcoming federal election. So there are a number of questions we've put on notice about the fact-checking process that Facebook has in place with AAP and AFP. A number of these questions went to the turnaround time between the posting of mis or disinformation and the assessment of the accuracy of that information. You made it clear in your submission that once a story is debunked by our third-party fact checkers, we make it less visible on Facebook and Instagram, but you weren't able to give any sort of timeframes around what we should expect that process to take. Can I just ask, in the context of a 4-week election campaign, time is of the essence, and your question notice said that what's important is that once a story is debunked by a third-party fact checkers, we make it less visible on Facebook and Instagram. Can I just put it to you and get your view on the fact that it's not just the debunking that matters, it's also the timeliness of the debunking in order for it to have an impact in an electoral process? Is that something you agree with?
Thanks very much, Deputy Chair. Perhaps I'll jump in on that one and then Mia might have more to add. So you're right that timeliness is an important factor. But one of the key considerations that we need to think about in a process where a fact checker is looking at a piece of content is obviously accuracy. They all are accredited under the gold standard set by the International Fact Checking Network. And because our fact checkers operate independently, it's really up to them to apply their good judgment, their editorial techniques, in order to undertake whatever research they need to in order to verify a claim. So as you've indicated, in many instances, they're able to do that very quickly. If it's debunking where an image might have originated from and it's a simple Google search, the turnaround time can be relatively quick. If it's a more complex claim that requires further research, investigation, confirmation with people who might have been involved, and then preparation of a detailed fact check response, that can take a little longer. And so it's that application of their good editorial judgment and accuracy, which is incredibly important. Obviously, if an independent third-party fact checker got one of those fact checks wrong, and we were telling people that that their finding was correct and it later turned out not to be correct, that would undermine trust in the fact-checking process as well. So accuracy is a really important objective for the work that they do as well.
Yeah, but you don't track times or don't have any KPIs about times for fact-checking processes?
We don't talk about the nature of the commercial agreements that we have with our fact-checking partners because they are subject to commercial confidentiality. But we do have a number of transparency tools that people can take, even if they're not able to look at the average turnaround times of fact-checking organisations. So both of our fact-checking partners in Australia provide a list of all the fact checks that they've done. We have services like CrowdTangle that are available in order for people to track what types of content are receiving engagement on our services. So there's a whole host of ways where we provide transparency so people can hold that process to account.
Yeah, you'll understand that I'm a little bit cynical, though, about commercial and confidence being particularly relevant to something of such significant public interest. You've talked about the consequences of getting a fact check wrong in demoting information that's actually accurate. There is a harm on the other side of this about promoting and allowing advertising to promote content that is inaccurate, demonstrably inaccurate as well, and only dealing with it after the horse has bolted after an election campaign. Like the harm is already done at that point.
Yeah, I understand. Obviously, our fact checkers are really committed to the objective of combating misinformation, partnering well with us to combat misinfo whenever it arises. And so it's their expertise their editorial judgment, that very high level gold certification they receive under the International Fact Checking Network, where we really rely on their expertise, their independence in order to make judgments about the most urgent claims, the most significant claims, and the ones that they need to prioritise in order to turn around very quickly. So I think the independence of our fact checkers is also an important feature in order to give people confidence about that program, that it's not directed by Meta or not directed by us, it's by the fact-checking experts who have these international standards that they need to comply with in order to continue being a fact-checking partner of ours. So many of those decisions around how to prioritise claims, how quickly they're able to turn them around, those we leave in the hands of the independent fact-checkers.
If I can also just build on that, sorry, Deputy Chair, just if I can build on that for just one moment. I mean, obviously one of the signals that fact checkers are looking at is the virality of a post or how much engagement it is getting. And so, they're going to be prioritising those that are getting significant reach. In terms of being able to provide more precision on the average time, it's challenging, but obviously virality is a key part of this.
So in another question I noticed, you said that your fact checkers prioritise quite provably false claims, especially ones that are timely, trending and important to the average person. So would that include content like the lie that was being spread on Facebook during the last federal election that Labor was proposing a death tax?
Well, with that particular example, there's probably multiple categories of content. I might just take a moment to talk through those categories because the role of fact checkers differed a little bit depending on what the type of content was. So certainly if people were making a claim that the Labor Party and the Greens had a secret agreement to impose a 40% death tax, which is a very specific and verifiable claim, our fact checker at the time, Agence France Presse, found that to be false. And we took action to demote both the original post and a very large number of similar posts in response to the advice that our fact checker had provided. When it comes to other categories of content, we did see, for example, political figures making claims about what an elected government from the ALP, what steps they might take. And that's the type of speech in which there's incredible scrutiny. And we've discussed at the committee previously the importance of ensuring that we're able to have proper democratic debate and that a platform such as ourselves is only taking steps in relation to limiting what political parties say when there is a real world harm element. And so that category of material wasn't subject to fact checking. And then the third category is when people were expressing simply a political opinion that can't be verified. For example, you can't trust a particular party on tax related issues. That's not something that can be proven true or proven false. And so they also are ineligible for fact checking. So certainly where there are false claims that are verifiable, they're specific, fact checkers can indicate whether it's true or false. That's where we think that's an appropriate role for them to bring their editorial expertise in order to indicate what is correct and what's not. If it's people just expressing an opinion and it's not about making a particular claim that may not be verifiable, that's not within scope of what we think it's appropriate for fact checkers to look at.
Yeah, can you just come back to us on notice about the time between the Labor Party first writing to you about those lies and that deprioritisation occurring? I think we need to address the time lag on this issue coming up for the next federal election. I do want to move to some specific questions, though, about misinformation in the next federal election campaign, and particularly a recent report from the advocacy group Reset Australia about election-related mis and disinformation. So there's been some media coverage, I'm sure you saw, about Reset running an experiment to test the automated moderation of Facebook ads by running a series of ads with misinformation related specifically to the electoral process, so not about opinion, but about the operation of the upcoming federal election. So some of these misleading ads purported to be announcements by the Australian Electoral Commission saying things like you can vote electronically, or that unvaccinated people can't vote, or even that the election had been cancelled due to COVID. Reset says that these ads are all approved and run as scheduled. So these ads would have a serious potential to mislead and interfere with the proper conduct of an election. So if they were to occur, particularly during an election period. So can you explain what happened here, why these ads weren't detected by your automated approvals process and weren't accepted?
Yeah, thanks very much, Deputy Chair, for the chance to discuss this one. I think there's some background information here that might be helpful. Perhaps I might just begin by explaining when it comes to reviewing ads that might violate our policies, that we have quite a comprehensive enforcement approach that applies at different points in the process. So without going to too much detail, because we try to avoid giving bad actors a playbook on how to avoid our enforcement, essentially we have processes, human and technological, in order to detect ads that might violate our policies, both when it's originally uploaded, as the ads are going live, and after the ads have gone live. And so there are some types of integrity measures. So, for example, being able to refer material to a third-party fact checker that are only able to be deployed after an ad has gone live. And so in this particular instance, I think it's important just to confirm that these ads did not go live. That was only the initial point of our enforcement approach, which would have applied. And so it's not correct to look at the exercise undertaken by this lobby group as an indication of whether our systems are able to adequately detect or enforce potential misinformation. There's a couple of additional points which I think are helpful to talk about in terms of the content of these ads and other similar ads. The lobby group's report doesn't recognise, for example, that there were a number of ads that we did detect at their initial upload and that we indicated were violating our policies immediately. And so there are indications of those processes working quite well in detecting those types of ads. In relation to the 5 that are the subject of the report, 3 of those violate our policies around voter interference or voter fraud, or they would violate if they went live. The other 2 violated our policies in terms of not having correct authorizations. And so you may remember from our previous conversation at the committee that having strict authorization and a verification processes for political and social ads is something that we've rolled out in order to ensure the integrity of ads in the Australian election, as well as the transparency during the ad library as well. And so 2 of those ads would not have complied with that policy as well if it had gone live. So I think the important point to confirm for the committee's benefit is, as the ads did not go live, they weren't subject to the full suite of enforcement tools that we deploy in instances like this. And so it's not correct to use this exercise to suggest that it's a reflection on our ability to detect and enforce on concerning ads in the Australian election.
Okay, so those additional review and enforcement processes, do they apply to all ads or just ads where the the political or social issues content is selected?
Yeah, that's a good question, because there are different enforcement approaches that we take depending on whether it's a political and social ad or whether it's a general ad. Generally, political and social ads are subject to much stricter enforcement on our platform than general ads. And I think one of the important points to make as well is we are conscious that people may choose to run a political or social ad but not declare it as such, and so they're not following our policies. And we do have technology and human review in order to detect ads that might fall into that category as well. So there is a much greater level of enforcement and integrity measures available for political and social ads that could have an impact on the Australian election.
So in this case, like Reset didn't tick the box for social and political ads, but why didn't the system pick this up? If they're using words like ballots and Australian Electoral Commission, AEC, shouldn't there have been a technical system that flagged that this is clearly about social and political issues? Sorry, Mr. Machin, I think you've accidentally gone back on mute.
Apologies. Thanks very much for raising it. I should have confirmed earlier that despite having a very comprehensive enforcement approach when it comes to political and social ads, I don't want to pretend that technology or human review processes are perfect. There will be potentially instances where something could make it through. And so that's why it's important to not just have enforcement and detection approaches that occur after these ads go live, but also very close partnerships with all of the types of entities who will be scrutinising these ads on our platform. So it's part of the reason we've been working so closely with the Australian Electoral Commissioner, why we make tools like the Ad Library available so that researchers, journalists, lobby groups, other people who might be scrutinising advertising activity on our platform, people are able to look for these ads, raise them to our attention. So if there has been an error or there has been a mistake, we can respond to it as quickly as possible. So it's a comprehensive enforcement suite of enforcement processes that also are applicable and available after the ads have gone live as well.
Okay, so it sounds like you're saying there's a layered series of approaches to try and catch these issues. Can I ask then what role the enforcement history of the account making these ads plays in that? Accounts that are found to be serial abusers, continually breaching community guidelines, rules, do they attract closer attention than just the automated scrutiny review?
Yeah, good question. So we made publicly available last year for the first time, actually, some more information about the enforcement approach that we take across everything on our platform, both paid and non-paid related content. And it can vary a little bit depending on exactly what the type of violation might be, what the type of content is. But what we publicised is that we take a graduated approach to enforcement. And so there'll be a point where someone will post a piece of content that violates our community standards and we'll just send them a warning. When it gets to content that is more frequent or is more severe, there are additional steps that we'll take, including potentially removing the ability for someone to monetize or advertise on our services at all. And then obviously the highest tier of the graduated level of enforcement is that we remove them from our services altogether. So certainly you're right that someone's enforcement history both on paid and non-paid related content is a key factor that we look at when we're reviewing ads that might be brought to our attention.
So just the final question I have, and then I'll hand over to the chair. So when I asked you about whether additional scrutiny would be provided to the United Australia Party, who has continually breached your community guidelines and had content taken down repeatedly in the last 12 months, you've said that, quote, "For details about the enforcement history behind any particular page, we recommend you contact the administrators of the page." Can I just ask why you're referring me to the administrators of the page? Like, surely it's a public interest, your approach to serial misinformation on your platform and whether that will be caught by your misinformation processes. Can you understand this isn't a private matter? This is something that all actors in our political system have an interest in understanding. Indeed, even the subjects of this scrutiny.
Yeah, I understand. Perhaps I'll comment and then Mia may have more that she'd like to add. I think in some instances, definitely we recognise that there can be a public interest in confirming or denying the enforcement approach that we've taken to particular pieces of content or particular ads. And so you have seen that in relation to particularly high profile matters in the past. But we're also weighing up the need to respect the privacy of someone's enforcement history as well. It's a challenging position to be in if we were asked by any political party to provide the enforcement history of another political party. It can be an uncomfortable position to be in and quite challenging to determine the right way forward. So there's a number of considerations that we take here. So generally we don't reveal the enforcement history of particular pages publicly. Certainly if we get requests from security agencies or from regulators, and we're responsive to those requests, but we do have reservations and concerns about revealing private enforcement histories for any page at our whim to make that publicly known.
Yeah. Okay, I don't have any more questions. I'm happy to speak back to the chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Chair. I just direct you back to the questions on notice, some of which I put on following a conversation we had around upholding whether they're called hateful content policy, I think you call them community standards policies. Every social media platform seems to vary the name of this particular policy. But we put together, I think, 6 examples across a range of platforms, and you were very helpful in responding back to let us know whether in each of these instances they would violate your community standards policy. And I know you have several different iterations of that, so I thank you for that. I've gone through it and had a good look. I just wanted to, I really want to explore, there's a range of sort of areas I'd like to explore further to understand. I put out 6 examples, and they came from Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, just to let you know. I hadn't identified that, but they did come from those areas. And of the 6, you indicated there was only 1 that did not violate your policies. You also indicated that of the 6, 5 of them would meet the threshold regardless of whether it was public or private. A public figure or a private individual. So that was very helpful. Thank you. I'd just like to point out that the one that I outlined from Facebook that you said this comment would violate our policies and would be removed regardless of whether it was aimed at a private individual or a public figure. This was the one indicating about, I don't actually really want to read it out, but it's pretty horrific, talking about toasting marshmallows in the fire, having sliced open with a chainsaw, all sorts of things like that. I think you'll be well aware of it, and we can refer to it in the questions. That was put up on Facebook. It was left there for several weeks. There were 10 that I counted, female members of parliament, that were tagged in this post, including me. And I actually had to go via legal means to actually have that removed. You've said it would violate your policies regardless of whether it was an individual or whether it was a public figure. Clearly the demeaning, degrading content directed at women, but also the violence advocated in it, I can well understand why it wouldn't meet your policy. That makes sense. My question is, why wasn't it taken down by your algorithms or by Facebook if it was such a clear violation?
I'm happy to respond to this one. I mean, we're very grateful that you were able to give us the specifics, because it can sometimes be challenging to answer questions about this in the abstract. I think that, I mean, obviously this type of content is, abhorrent and incredibly distressing given the violence that's being advocated. But in terms of our ability, I think in terms of the ability of artificial intelligence to identify all of this type of content, it's still learning and we're getting better at doing it. So I think that, over time, as we become more sort of attuned to some of the different ways in which people are expressing this bullying and harassing content, then we can get better at taking the action ourselves. But at the moment, not everything is going to get caught by the algorithms, particularly with bullying and harassment. It has been one of the categories in our community standards enforcement report that has had sort of the lowest proactive detection rate and is slowly building up as the machines learn from themselves. And so hopefully we can, in the meantime, in the future, but in the meantime, this is part of the reason why we do have reporting functions and other tools that are available to try to protect public figures such as yourself from having to see these types of comments. So that's different types of filters for comments on pages and other things like that, and controls on tagging so that you don't have to be exposed to it.
Sure. I take your point, but I come back to another point. Recently, and I was very grateful for the ability to raise this and have it addressed, but recently, I was made aware of a minister of the faith, of a religious faith, who wanted to pray for 40 days. And they put up a prayer siege on Instagram and was taken down. I think the words are shadow banned. And in fact, there'd been some other comments around this, prayer vigil siege that had simply been removed, and it said removed by the moderator, but these people said they hadn't actually removed it. How is it possible that the algorithm can capture a call to prayer and take that down because of potential violation of some community standard, but not capture this? How is, in this day and age, I don't understand how that is possible.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I'm not sure if you still have like any details about the account or the individual post, because just to confirm what happened here, it would be really helpful to get that detailed example, and very happy to take that on notice. And without that detail, it's hard to sort of know if it was taken down by the algorithm. I mean, I feel that your question does go to concerns around the accuracy around our enforcement. So if it's helpful, I am happy to talk about how we try to improve the accuracy of our enforcement.
Yeah, look, it does go to it, and I'll tell you where I'm thinking, because firstly, I appreciate you coming back a second time very much. Secondly, it's a really important issue, and the point has been made by another member of the committee in some of their lines of inquiry in previous public hearings, where you get, and I think one of the social media platforms referred to over-moderation, that they were prepared to look at over-moderation when it came to concerns about disinformation and misinformation. And arguably, you could look at, you know, something being captured by an algorithm because they use the word siege. What I don't understand is why the same enthusiastic process is not applied to harmful content that is demeaning, derogatory, dehumanizing, and does not meet the social media platform's own terms of service and standards. Why is it that the algorithm can be so advanced for misinformation and disinformation and to take down very quickly, or perhaps the Deputy Chair's concerns not so quickly, but to take it down? But the same does not apply when it comes to online harm and abuse directed at individuals, an individual or individuals.
Well, I think, I mean, firstly, it's hard to, provide precise comparisons without the specifics. But I guess sort of from a principle basis, I mean, with respect to, say, disinformation, that is actually looking at behavioural signals for the most part, less about content-based analyses, because it is often, content that might not otherwise violate policies, but the nature of the way it's being shared on the platform suggests that it's being shared for harmful effect. And in relation to a lot of the misinformation, I mean, where it's sort of harmful health misinformation, we have been building up detailed sort of machine learning models to try to detect that once it's been identified. And then in relation to the other misinformation that we downrank, that goes through a fact-checking process. I think in relation to some of the different linguistic ways that people are using hateful and harmful content, I think there is still work to be done in terms of how the language models and the artificial intelligence does that. But I think we get better over time, because we use the examples both of the content that we do remove and then also train classifiers to surface more harmful content to improve that. And that's why, in our latest community standards enforcement report, you'll see an increase in the bullying and harassment content that we're able to proactively detect.
So I look at, there's two areas here. The first is my concern. I'll share up front my concern. My concern is that I see very, very, very strong community standard policies or hateful content policies or insert name of keep the community safe policy from various platforms. I almost can't fault them, very hard to fault them. But I find a very big gap with the application of them. And I'll give you an example. The example is in your hate speech policy. We define hate speech as a direct attack against people on the basis of what we call protected characteristics, including gender identity. We define attacks as violent or dehumanizing speech, harmful stereotypes. I'm just interested, and I know this is probably something that an algorithm wouldn't pick up, but I was interested in the response by a young person when reading this, a young 20-something-year-old woman when reading this, and saying, how is it possible that this particular statement does not violate your standards? I bet she rages so hard a natural disaster occurs every time she has her period. If someone can, I take it, I grant you, I would understand if it wasn't picked up by an algorithm. But if somebody complained about that as being a harmful stereotype based on gender, a demeaning, dehumanizing, harmful stereotype, how is it that, like, it just seems that there's a bit of a mismatch here. Do you have any comment on that, and what can be done to bridge the gap?
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I think in terms of the consistency across the platforms, I certainly appreciate, we all have policies and they might vary slightly in how they're described or how we articulate them. And then also we're increasingly sharing transparency data. And I think that's one of the reasons that we suggested to the committee that, we start trying to benchmark industry so that, if one of us is stronger on one particular thing and one of us is weaker, that you can start holding us to account and start making sure that there's a consistent standard applied across the platforms, because obviously that is the best response for the community. But in relation to the specific comment reference, sorry, did you want to?
No, no, that's okay, finish. Sorry, there's a bit of a latency here.
Oh, apologies. It's probably all the rain, to be honest. I share your view and the view of the person who contacted you about this. I absolutely share your view from a personal perspective. This is highly distasteful and deeply offensive. But however, when we're working to try to set the threshold as to when it trips over and where it is distasteful but does not violate, and that is where we have worked with we're trying to look at a range of different pieces of content and work with different experts, and we've focused on sort of very extreme types of violence and also hateful stereotypes designed to cause harm, and the sort of general objectionable nature of this comment doesn't violate our policies.
So there's so many questions from your answer. I'll try to get to all of them. The first one is in relation to what you've just said. When social media platforms are moderating the content that we're allowed to see and not allowed to see by algorithms, call it what you will, but literally moderating that, and now being almost the moderator of what is acceptable in our community, my question is, where does community standards come in? Because I fail to see how a global technology giant can actually and I see a problem here, where effectively what your answer has told me is that Facebook is helping to shape the standards around abuse and harmful content online, rather than our community upholding the standards that we consider to be acceptable. In an environment like Australia, where we have had a spotlight put very squarely and appropriately placed on abuse against women, and where we're looking more and more at this whole issue about how disagreement and dissent is often expressed in abusive ways, perhaps there's a longer conversation there. Do you think there might be a role or some recommendations that this committee might make in relation to ensuring that community standards are upheld, and where they are perhaps higher standard than where a social media platform might otherwise deem it to be, that those community standards be the ones that be upheld? Have you got any sort of comment on that? That's a long conversation. That's a long comment, I guess. But I think what I'm saying to you is exactly what you've articulated is what I'm seeing is the challenge.
I'm happy to start, and then I'm not sure if Josh has anything to add there. I mean, I think that you're right in the sense of, what are the standards and what, violates and what doesn't violate are very nuanced decisions and issues. And that's why we do have a very extensive process with our product policy team in terms of consulting widely with, experts around the world before we're making different changes to our policies. And we've certainly consulted with a number of women's groups here in Australia as well over the last several years, and particularly some of the changes that led to our greater protections for female public figures in particular were based on roundtables that we held around the world, including here in Australia. So we have tried to engage with the community, but certainly if there are concerns around, different, sort of standards for Australia, then I think that's a helpful conversation. I guess the question is going to be, what level of enforcement they have as to whether it's laws or whether it's industry codes or other accountability conversations. But Josh, please.
Yeah, Chair, I was just going to pick up that exact same comment from Mia, which I think is right, which is the community standards or the policies that we develop and adhere to are just one of a number of ways that standards can be set about speech that people see on our services. So the policies we set are one of them. The laws that Australia set are another example. And so, for example, where we might see legislation in Australia that sets a standard around content that is different to Meta's community standards, or there's something that might not be permitted under Australia law but would be okay under our policies, that's where we'll take steps in order to geo-block or restrict access to that content.
But I hear that, but there is a very big distinct difference between saying something that's against the law, which is you're effectively talking about freedom of speech, and you're talking about this grey area here, which basically you saying, oh no, we have to make it illegal in order to be able to police it. But misinformation and disinformation is not made illegal in order for you to be able to remove it. So with due respect, if I don't accept that argument, if I just say to you that seems inconsistent to me, my question is, when we're looking at abuse and online harm on a day when we heard about a young 15-year-old who is no longer with us today because she suffered too much bullying online as well as in person. When we are looking at that, my question is, what can we be doing to use, her mother's words, little humans? What can we be doing? What more can we be doing to keep people safe online? I look at your outstanding policies and I go back to harmful stereotypes, and yet there's a harmful, degrading stereotype. My question is, if that was directed at me as a private individual, just as a woman, and I said, I find this offensive, I'd like it taken down, would Facebook support a right to request removal? So what I'm saying is, enabling those who it is harming to have more agency in some of these decisions.
I think absolutely. I mean, I think that's so. Obviously, we've got as to build on Josh's point. There's the policies and how we enforce those, and then there's obviously the different regulatory standards that we work to comply with, and then we recognise that there can be individual situations that are happening that we are not able to understand in terms of whether or not a particular type of comment will be triggering or harmful, and so we do offer then a layer of additional tools for people to use. So things like the hidden word filter, where you could put, if you could put particular words in to make sure that you're protected from having to see those kinds of messages given to you. There's also different moderation tools where you can, again, we've got some default moderation tools to block profanity, and then you can also build custom lists as well to protect the account holder as well. So we do try to offer a range of different approaches.
I hear that, but again, if I come back to online harm and online abuse, the difference with the online world, if I am saying something incredibly harmful and abusive to someone who is sitting next to me in this very office, the impact is great on that individual, but it's not a megaphone. It's not heard by however many other people see that. The very great difference with online harm is that once it's there, it can be seen by countless others, and the shame factor, the overwhelming sense of what the impact on an individual, in my view, is magnified multiple times by that very nature of it being seen online. And so it's not enough just to be able to go, oh, well, if you don't like this particular word, you can not see it. because they might be directed at reputation, at this, at that. And if we're having a whole conversation around how do we keep people safe online, we actually have to take the whole gamut of that, I would argue. We actually have to look at the long trail of trauma that some of these very real examples can actually leave, and see what can we do more, what can we do better to provide a safe environment, and where harm does occur, how can we take steps to redress that harm in a way that doesn't sometimes make it worse by, having all of these barriers to be able to deal with it.
I think, we very much share and appreciate your concern. And a number of the tools that I mentioned, I should have added, they do actually hide the comment so that, if it is something that has been deemed to be offensive by you, then it's not just that you will be protected from seeing it, but also other people won't be able to see it. The commentator will still be able to see it, because we don't want to create a triggering situation where that sort of enrages and inflames them. But we have tried to, in many instances, hide harmful comments of this nature, so that it's not just the person who's protected from it, but also it doesn't sort of, incite other people to think that this is an acceptable way to behave. So I think, this is again where I think suggestion of having these sort of industry-wide conversations about sort of the different standards in terms of the toolings and policies can be helpful to make sure that we're addressing in specific community concerns, but also benchmarking it across industry.
Can I ask, when you say industry, sorry, I'm going everywhere at the moment based on your question, based on your answers, not actually based on my line of questions.
They're giving too lengthy answers, so they're giving you lots of fertile ground.
Yeah, pretty much. Thank you. When I worked in the telco industry, there was what they called a mobile carriers forum, where there was an area where all of the various, like Telstra, Vodafone, Optus, etc., worked together in a, so there was a group, if you like. Do you have something similar when it comes to social media in Australia?
I think, Chair, it's a great question. It's definitely an area that's evolving. So we're seeing a lot of international collaboration in that space. So for example, there's been an organization recently created called the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership, which is doing some interesting thinking and work around content moderation. We've had the Global Internet Forum to Combat Terrorism, which became an independent organization about 2 years ago, particularly looks at terrorism-related content. And about 18 months ago, the Technology Coalition really revived a plan around safety of children. So it's certainly a fertile area where people are having lots of discussions about the right industry bodies or industry groupings. Locally within Australia, there's been a lot of work that's been done in order to bring a large group of companies together, particularly around developing an industry code under the Online Safety Act. And that's been convened by a number of industry associations, including Digi and Comms Alliance, which you'll also know very well from your previous telco days, as well as the Interactive Games and Entertainment Association, a whole bunch of relevant entities. It's pretty groundbreaking having all of those people around the table, and a broad range of companies, not just social media, but also the search engines, the app stores, the hosting services, the private messaging providers, all sitting around and talking about what are the right type of standards to set when it comes to protecting the safety of Australians online. So that's a process that's still underway, and that group is in close contact with the E-Safety Commissioner. But I guess to make an overarching observation is there's a lot of work and evolution that's happening in this space. Certainly, we wanted to signal in our submission and our previous appearance that we think there's more work to be done, particularly in Australia, to bring the industry together and to have discussions about what are the right standards on, for example, age-appropriate experiences for young people who are on social media services. We think that's a really fruitful area where industry could have some conversations about where there should be consistency or collaboration. So certainly we have a lot more appetite to be doing a lot more work as part of the industry to think about it collectively.
Thank you. And you're right about Digi and some of the others. Thank you for reminding me of that too. There's two questions I have before I'll go back to the issue about the algorithm. One is, I don't know if I mentioned it to you, but I did sort of think about it in some of the public hearing evidence we had earlier about some pubs and clubs in my community on the Central Coast, where they've come together with a very simple a simple but effective policy, banned from one, banned from all. Would there be potentially appetite for more cooperation, if you want to put it that way, between the platforms? Because if I just go back for a moment, often you'll find that even if you do get something banned or somebody banned or removed from one platform, they just go on to the next one. Or sometimes you can have the same perpetrator with multiple different anonymous accounts, going at it with one, on one platform, then over on another and over on another. Is there any appetite, or do you see a need for that? Would there be appetite for that? And also, would there be potentially appetite for standardization of some of the community standard policies that exist, such that, the moderation of them is well understood by users as well as the industry? That's a question.
Maybe I can start us off on that one, Chair, and Mia can jump in if I miss
Thank
anything.
you.
So we certainly have ample appetite to continue industry discussions about what more we can do collectively. So the short answer is yes, we think there's lots of areas that we could discuss with our industry colleagues in order to look at, well, what are the right areas where there should be harmonisation or a common approach, but there also might be areas where you actually want companies to take a different approach, because it becomes a race to the top then. So I think there's lots of discussions to be had about where is standardisation appropriate and where is it better to unlock some of those forces where people are innovating in ways that they can offer even greater safety for their users. When it comes to your thinking about ban from one, ban from all, and the pub analogy on the Central Coast, I think is really great. We're certainly very happy to have further discussions about what we might be able to do when it comes to recidivist behaviour or actors who are recurrently, persistently abusive or harmful. I think it's probably an area where there could be much greater discussion about how to design something like that in a way that's effective. But the initial thought that strikes me is that we have a really effective and thoughtful regulator in Australia in terms of e-safety. And so perhaps there's a role that the regulator can play in order to help indicate where there's a particular individual who should be banned across all platforms. So that's perhaps an initial reaction. We know eSafety have powers, for example, to target notices towards end users already. And so perhaps there are some opportunities to take advantage of having a very good regulator in this space to think about how to design an effective model. But we're certainly very happy to be part of conversations about what more we can all do together in relation to a suggestion like that.
Thank you. I am mindful of time, and I know that Mr. Kelly is being very patient, and I'm just going to ask 2 more questions and then hand to him. I actually am referring to the 3rd of February this year to the evidence given by Frances Horgan and to this committee. And I'll just read it, and it goes back to the whole issue of algorithms. And she said, I want to repeat again that I don't support using content-based safety strategies. I don't think they work very well. The thing I keep repeating is that the algorithms today are designed in such ways, and these are product choices, like those giant groups and how those giant groups are architected, that give the most reach to the most extreme ideas. Those ideas could be on the left or on the right. And then she said, she talked about engagement. And then she said, Facebook is good at distracting us and making us focus on the wrong things. Facebook knows that they've done internal studies. I'll just read this bit, sorry. Facebook overly relies on content moderation strategies, even though they're not effective, even though they're only taking down 3 to 5% of hate speech or less than 1% of graphic violence. They want their algorithms in the current run hot, maximized profit way. They could make simple changes and they would have fractions less profit. I'm just wondering, because I guess on the one hand, I'm sort of saying, is there a way that that algorithms could be more effective in identifying and removing harmful comment online directed at an individual or individuals. And on the other hand, pointing out, for example, with the 40 days of prayer, that was removed by an algorithm. And I'm just referring to Ms. Hogan's evidence saying that content moderation strategies only take down 3 to 5% of hate speech or 1% of graphic violence. She said they could make very simple changes and they would have fractions less profit. Would there be some changes that could be made to the way in which algorithms currently exist that would provide less over moderation, for want of a better term, when it came to some of these other areas on the one hand, but also more targeted, effective ability to pick up abuse and hateful content online on the other? Is there a different approach that could be used or something different that could be applied or considered by social media platforms?
Thanks very much, Chair. I'm happy to begin with that one, and then perhaps Mia can jump in. There's quite a few points there, so perhaps I might unpack a couple of them and Mia can pull up the points that I might miss. So in relation to harmful content and whether to take a content-based approach or an algorithm-based approach, our view is that you need to look at both. So where a particular piece of content might be harmful, it is right for us to remove it or for us to look at the particular specifics of the content. If it is hateful, if it's inciting violence, having a content-based approach and removing that material in order to make sure that we're not exposing further people to the harmful piece of content, we think is the right approach. And there are a number of, I'm conscious there's a number of pieces of legislation in Australia that have also been predicated on a content-based approach, like the Online Safety Act or the Abhorrent Violent Material Act. These are content-based strategies, and we've been supportive of these approaches. So I don't think we should dismiss the importance of looking at the details of the content. That said, there is additional work that we are doing as well in order to look at what role algorithms can play in order to reduce the distribution of content that may not be harmful or may not violate our community standards, but could be borderline or could come close. And so this is separate to the type of artificial intelligence that detects hateful content. I'm happy to come back, harmful content. I'm happy to come to that in a moment. But our global president, Sir Nick Clegg, put out a blog post last year in which he talked about the way that we can look at providing greater transparency around algorithms in order to understand the ways that they are distributing content to people. And he set this benchmark of saying there's more that we can do to provide transparency and control around algorithms that distribute content. And so in order to work towards that objective, we've done a couple of things in the last year. We've released a set of content distribution guidelines in order to outline, we have our community standards for the things that violate, but now we're also outlining the types of content that don't violate our policies, but that we think should reduce distribution anyway. So this includes content that might be spammy or sensational or misleading. And so we do see that there is a role for us to reduce the views or reduce the prevalence of content, even if it doesn't violate, if it falls into these particular categories. So we're being transparent about content that falls within those categories. And then the final point that I might make about algorithms before checking if Mia would have more to add is in relation to the role that they play in detecting and removing harmful content. So we report on this transparently in our community standards enforcement report. And we released the latest one just overnight, actually. So we have some fairly fresh figures for you. And these are very high quality metrics that have been developed with external advisors, a data transparency advisory group, and are also being independently audited as well in order to make sure that they are robust, high quality numbers. And what that indicates is for most categories of content, more than 90% of harmful content is being detected proactively via artificial intelligence and algorithms before someone needs to see it. And so we think that's a really important way in order to reduce the number of people who have to see a piece of content that might be harmful. And if we're looking at something like hate speech, It's something in the order of about 97% of content that violates our hate speech policies, we are detecting proactively via technology and algorithms before someone needs to see it or report it to us. And so the technology won't be perfect. There will be areas where it may over moderate or under moderate, but that's a pretty significant bulk of content that is being correctly picked up and removed for violating our policies before anybody needs to see it. And so perhaps the final point I might make is one of the additional metrics that we make available is we measure how many people saw that violating content before we detected it. It's an incredibly challenging and complicated industry-leading metric that we've been able to pull together, but we think it's very helpful in assessing the impact that violating content might have on actual individuals. And what we've seen in relation to hate speech is we've made such large investments in technology and human review in that space in recent years that the prevalence of hate speech, or the number of times that people see it before it's removed, has dropped dramatically by more than 50% in the last 12 to 18 months. And so now only about 2 or 3 content views in every 10,000 of hate speech, which is significantly lower than in the last couple of years. So I hope that picks up on some of the key points that you've made about content versus algorithm-based strategies, about the figures in terms of what we're able to review, and then providing greater transparency about the role that algorithms can play in limiting the distribution of borderline content. But perhaps I'll check, Mia, if there's anything I missed that you'd like to add.
Just 2 other points just to address your concern, Chair, around over-enforcement. So the first is that we do audit our enforcement processes, including our artificial intelligence, to try to understand, where we need to make changes. And we also audit the community operations team as well, just to make sure that we're understanding if we need to update the guidance that we're giving them in terms of how to enforce our policies. And then also we do have the ability for people to appeal. So if content is removed and they think it's an over-enforcement, or it could potentially have been picked up by an algorithm incorrectly, then they can appeal that. And then we also disclose our appeal action rates in the transparency report as well. So I think you're right. This is something where, this is an important conversation that we need to continue to have around what the best checks and balances are, particularly as we're relying more on technology to enforce our policies.
Thank you. I have a further question, but I'm going to hand to Mr. Kelly because my question is probably on a different topic. Questions from Mr. Kelly?
Thank you, Chair. Just firstly, a follow-up on the questions asked by the Deputy Chair. Can Meta give any guarantee at with the coming federal election that there will be no foreign interference by Meta in the Australian elections, such as blocking, censoring, shadow banning, or deplatforming official election candidates and political parties?
Thanks very much, Mr. Kelly. Obviously, we're not able to predict the future, but what we can say is that we enforce our policies, our community standards consistently on users on our platform, whether they're a private individual or a public figure.
Right. So if an election candidate for a political party put a post up that somehow disagreed with the community standard of Meta or one of your other fact checks, you would actually take action against a political candidate or a political party in an election campaign.
If a piece of content violates our community standards, then yes, we'll be removing it. And that's a really important protection that we have in place in order to protect the safety and the integrity of the election campaign. If we saw someone inciting violence, for example, I think the expectation of the community would be that we enforce these community standards and remove
political. But doesn't that also undermine and threaten our democracy if you are able to someone that is a candidate, a registered candidate at an election or a registered political party, if they make a particular statement that you are saying that if it somehow doesn't go along with your community standards, or one of your fact checkers disagrees with it, that you'll actually block, censor, shadow ban, or deplatform that political candidate or political party. Isn't that a direct foreign interference in the Australian election campaign?
Let me just make one clarification, Mr. Kelly, that we don't remove content that our third-party fact checkers have been found to be false. We remove content that violates our community standards by being harmful misinformation.
But you would
that can lead to
shadow ban.
real-world
You
harm.
would shadow ban or put other commentary on comments that say your fact checkers have a different opinion on.
Let me be quite clear about what we'll do when a fact checker tells us a piece of content is false. We apply a label to it, an interstitial, so people are only able to view the content if they choose to deliberately click through. And we'll take steps in order to reduce the distribution of that piece of content. We'll remove it from recommendations. We'll show it lower in people's feeds. But I do want to clarify that we don't wholesale remove content on the basis of a fact checker finding it to be false. We remove content that violates our community standards. And so if someone is, for example, inciting violence, then we enforce our community standards. That's something that we don't prohibit on our services. That's something that we'll be removing.
Give you another example. I'll give you another example then. Your community standards is that ivermectin is not an effective treatment, COVID treatment. If an election candidate or a political party had a policy that ivermectin was an effective treatment, and part of their election platform was that they would hand out kits, COVID kits, similar that is done in many South American countries, Central American countries, and in India, kits that contain ivermectin, that would breach your community standards. So therefore, you would block that political party or that election candidate from saying that on their platform.
So again, I just want to be clear, Mr. Kelly, we make publicly available the claims that we consider to cause misinformation, false claims that we consider to cause real world harm on the basis of the advice of experts, including the World Health Organization. And that includes false claims about treatments that do not cure COVID. And so there can be specific claims about ivermectin that may violate those policies. That's publicly available. But I do want to clarify that we're not removing a political party or a candidate on the basis of having a discussion about ivermectin or for discussing the issue generally. It's when these false claims are made that can lead to real world harm, a verifiable claim. That's the type of content that we'll remove.
Right. But just so you're actually confirming here with us that election candidates and political parties can be blocked, shadow banned, and censored depending on what you say.
I might just jump in here, Mr. Kelly. I think the first point to note is that when we remove content, we notify people that we have removed it, and we also provide them with a warning that if they continue to violate our community standards, that they may lose access to our services and ultimately lose access to their accounts. So there are a number of steps that we have in place to try to make sure that people understand what the rules are surrounding the use of our service, and we try to make sure that we're giving people ample warning of that. And so I think it's not an accurate characterization to think that one claim that we remove is necessarily going to result in an entire account coming down, unless, of course, it's an incredibly serious offence like terrorism, etc.
Okay. So how does that coexist with the implied right of free political speech under the Australian Constitution? If Meta is saying that they will consider blocking, censoring, shadow banning or deplatforming election candidates and political parties in the federal election campaign.
My apologies, Mr. Kelly. I'm not the expert on Australian constitutional law. I mean, obviously, we work to comply with Australian law and obviously receive notifications and complaints from the Australian Electoral Commission as well, and work to be responsive to those as well.
Okay. You mentioned you comply with Australian law. The Electoral Act of 1918, Section 327, states that a person shall not hinder or interfere with the free exercise or performance of any political right of a person. Now, if a candidate is running for an election, they are officially nominated candidate from a registered political party, aren't you hindering them by potentially shadow banning, deplatforming them, and therefore taking away, interfering with their political right? And that would be potentially a breach of Australian law?
Mr. Kelly, what I'd add is we've been working very closely with the Australian Electoral Commission to make sure that we can review any action that we take that they're concerned about with respect to Australian electoral law. I don't think so. We can follow up on notice if I'm incorrect, but I don't think we've received any referrals from the AEC under that particular section. But if they sent something over to us, of course, we would review it.
Okay, but just so I'm clear on this point, the reason why I'm asking, there is a private members bill by the member for Dawson currently before the Parliament that suggests that you should not be able to censor, deplatform or shadow ban an election candidate or a political party, especially in the lead up to an election campaign. So that's why I'm particularly asking these questions. So at the moment, you're saying, yes, you basically reserve the right, or there may be circumstances that you would.
Well, Mr. Kelly, I think obviously we have our policies, and they're the terms on which we offer our services, and then we work to respect Australian law. And if there's a gap between our policies and Australian law, then we work to comply with Australian law. I have to say, to date, the threshold set under Australian law, where there has been a gap, has been slightly higher and not lower. So obviously we're happy to review that as and when this progresses.
Okay. Just one, another question. Would you block proceedings of the Australian Parliament?
I mean, I think it's very hard to speak in hypotheticals without more details there. I think it would probably depend on what was occurring. I mean, there have been instances, for example, where there's been, violence associated with parliaments, where we have taken measures to remove content that is inciting violence or otherwise, threatening harm.
So there's a provision of Australian law which applies to the Bill of Rights, which basically says proceedings of the Parliament, that freedoms of speech and debates of the proceedings of Parliament ought not to be impeached or questioned in any court or any place out of Parliament. So you're basically saying Meta is above that part of Australian law, that you would question and impeach the proceedings of the Australian Parliament.
With respect, Mr. Kelly, I don't agree with that characterisation of our comments. What we're trying to say is that it's hard to guess every single instance in which something might be occurring within the Parliament, but if there is something where we're concerned about violence or harm,
let's narrow it down.
To enforce our policies.
How about we narrow it down to a speech by a member of the Australian Parliament in the Australian Parliament that would be otherwise recorded in Hansard? Are you saying that is still within Meta's scope, that you would question what was said and potentially impeach it by way of shadow ban, blocking or censoring?
Mr. Kelly, it's a little challenging to talk about a hypothetical without knowing the specifics of what piece of content might be service. I mean, we're not...
The proceedings of the Australian Parliament are protected by law from impeachment or questioning in any court or any other place out of Australia. That is part of Australian law. So my question is, do you exempt the proceedings and the speeches made in the Australian Parliament from your so-called community standards and fact-checking?
So we apply our policies consistently in relation to harmful content.
Right, okay. So therefore you're confirming that you would question and impeach the proceedings of the Australian Parliament and debates within the Australian Parliament?
Mr. Kelly, I'm not sure I agree with that characterisation. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer trained in the nuances of the definition of this particular part of the parliamentary legislation, but I don't agree necessarily with that characterisation.
Mr. Kelly, sorry. Mr. Kelly, I just ask, I think there's been, and I was on mute before, I'm sorry, I couldn't. Yeah, I think it's important that the witnesses are allowed to answer the questions and then perhaps move on to your next question.
Okay, I have just one more question.
And not reinterpret them. Thank you.
I have one final question. The point, just that you can confirm or not, that the proceedings of the Australian Parliament, including speeches made by members of the Australian Parliament, are still subject to being deplatformed, shadow banned, and censored by Meta.
If there was harmful content that was shared on our services, then we would enforce our policies in relation to that.
Okay, with no special exemption for the proceedings of the Australian Parliament.
I'm not aware that that's an exception under our policies, but Josh, did you want to add anything?
We apply our policies consistently to private individuals and public figures, and that includes politicians.
Okay. A final question. Has Facebook or Meta ever been approached or received any correspondence from the Prime Minister's office regarding Facebook posts by members of Parliament?
I think we might have to take on notice what we could talk about there. Mr. Kelly, I don't have recollection of every possible conversation, and we would have to confirm what we might be able to provide on notice.
Okay, I'll just ask the question again so it's clear. Has Facebook ever been approached or received correspondence from the Prime Minister's office regarding Facebook posts by members of the Australian Parliament?
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. We certainly heard the question, and so we can take that on notice.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And I must again thank our witnesses for providing us this additional time. We do appreciate that very much. Mr. Machin, you referenced that your policies are consistently applied to private individuals and public figures. Can I just ask you to elaborate on that, because it goes to actually the very question I wanted to ask. And I'll explain the reason why I want to ask it first for context. Some conversations with other platforms have indicated there seems to be two standards, a different standard for private individuals, for want of a better term, and a different standard for those who might be considered to be public figures, whether they be media personalities, politicians, sports stars, etc. What is Facebook's approach to application of your policies in relation to individuals and public figures?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, Chair, because it gives me an opportunity to clarify my answer from earlier. So when I was saying our policies are applied consistently, what I was referring to is that the policies are applied consistently regardless of who has said it. So if a public figure says it, then we'll treat it the same as if a private individual says it. Mm-hmm. I think perhaps just from recollection of your of the appearance of other technology companies, I suspect you may be asking more about when someone is the subject of a post rather than the speaker of a post. Which is probably a slightly different question, which we can provide more information about that if that's helpful. But I thought I'd better just clarify that my earlier answer was a shorthand description to how we apply it depending on the speaker.
Thank you. So you're right, I am actually asking that, and I guess it's probably applicable if it's the same when you're talking about someone who says something. Do you have a similar approach when it comes to content where it's about the other person? So let's just go to it. Harmful, abusive and harmful content. Is a similar standard applied there?
I'm happy to speak to this one, Chair, because
Yeah.
our policies have evolved over the years.
Thank you.
So I think originally, I've been at Meta now for 10 years. I think when I first joined the company, we did try to make a very clear distinction between private figures and public figures and allow a large amount of commentary about public figures. And we would remove a much, lower threshold of harmful content in relation to private individuals. And the theory behind that was that public figures, have a mouthpiece and an audience, and so they can correct and challenge things that are said about them. I think what we've seen over the years is that there's obviously not all public figures, have staffs and teams that can moderate comments, and some of the nature of the commentary was really not directed to matters of public debate, and they were much more, abusive or gendered or sexualized, and so that's where we have changed our policies to provide similar levels of protection for public figures as private figures with respect to this very, harmful and frankly disgusting category of content. I don't know that that's consistently applied across all platforms, and I guess that is one of the reasons why we were suggesting maybe some of these industry forums to benchmark, policies and tools and enforcement could be helpful, so that you have an easier way to pass the differences between us rather than us trying to sort of cumbersomely explain it to you.
Yeah, no, I take your point. The reason I asked this, and I thank you, by the way, I'll just say my personal view is that makes very good sense moving towards one standard for all, particularly if you're doing it on the other side as well, but one standard for all. And I guess I've come to this view as a result of this inquiry, hearing about some of the content that you're right, it's vile, it's disgusting, it's dehumanizing, but because it's a public figure, whether it be a journalist or a sports star or a politician, it seems as though, oh well, because of their job, effectively, they can be spoken to like this, they can be treated like this. I look at the slippery slope. I just think if we're actually serious about calling out some of these harmful behaviours, then why would we have two standards? Why would we have two classes of people just on the basis of their job? That to me makes no sense. So my question is, would you support, or would this even be possible, some form of consideration of a single standard that is easily understood? That's where I was also going about, consistent standards that's easily and well understood, that's easily and well moderated, such that we can get this conversation happening around having very healthy, respectful disagreement and dissent, but drawing a line at this traversing into abuse that can be very destructive.
Yeah, I certainly understand where you're coming from with your question. I think that's why we have made the updates that we have to provide those greater protections to public figures. I think one of the challenges, though, is in relation to, say, bullying and harassment of private individuals, where it's, a private individual reporting something, we apply a very, very low threshold to assume it's bullying and harassment, because even if it doesn't use words that we might normally think of as being bullying and harassment, we just assume that there's some additional context that we can't tell, that means that this is harassing for the person, and so we err on the side of removal. In relation to public figures, what we've done is tried to work with people to identify what, some of the things that are just not connected to public debate, or sort of commentary that can be considered reasonable, and take action on that. And then in addition, we've rolled out new and additional tools to give sports stars and women journalists and female politicians sort of that added layer of protection, so that they don't have to be exposed to content that's sort of distasteful but not meeting the threshold of the sort of gendered abuse or other violent commentary that we do now remove for.
Is there room to go further?
Well, I think this can be an area for debate. I mean, I think when we're looking at when and how to update our policies, we are trying to take on board feedback from a large number of individuals and experts around the country. And also we look at specific examples to try to make sure that we can sort of benchmark where things are reasonable and where things are not reasonable and can tip over into being harmful. So I think, this should and could be an area for debate. And we're looking to release more resources to help encourage this conversation, particularly among our female public figures here in Australia.
Thank you for that. Are there further questions from the Deputy Chair or Mr. Kelly?
No questions from me, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, can I thank both of you? And I'd also just like to shout out to the Secretariat to thank them as well for taking this additional time. We very much appreciate it. Very, very much appreciate it. To indicate that I think there's been a few questions taken on notice, and to ask you if you could provide that information back through to the Secretary by the 9th of March 2022. And I would like to indicate that you will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and you'll have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. Can I thank you very much for your time, for your attendance, for your thoughtful responses, and your willingness to appear and participate in this committee in the work of this inquiry. It's very important. And I now declare this public hearing closed and the committee adjourned. Thank you very much.